Chapter 119. After the action officers left, the cabin returned to silence. While waiting anxiously, only KP was lying on the table alone, writing and drawing on his form, humming a song comfortably, and throwing a couple of dice from time to time. After a while, a stack of paper was piled on the table. The middle-aged man who was originally the host looked at it with confusion for a long time. Finally, he couldn't hold back his curiosity and asked, "Mr. KP, what are you doing?" "It's just a game." KP looked up and said, "Do you guys like to play games?" Everyone looked over in confusion. "Since we're bored anyway, how about a tabletop role-playing game?" KP threw the dice, caught it in the air, and happily introduced, "This is a very popular game at the border of the dark net. Although the rules are complicated, the degree of freedom and fun are not comparable to other computer games. As long as you try it, you will be immersed in it and can't extricate yourself." Someone seemed to be attracted and asked, "How is it specifically played? Is it like mahjong or poker?" No, it's completely different," KP patiently explained. "To put it simply, you will get the beginning of a story through the host, which is me, the dictation. And you need to play the role of an investigator, go with other investigators, participate in the story through role-playing and your own choices, explore this story, and finally solve the problem given by the creator, get the treasure, or succeed in surviving. It's really a game that fits the current situation very well." He seemed to have said something strange, but everyone ignored it in a trance. Instead, they were attracted by his description and were eager to try it out. After KP finished, he asked, "How about it, everyone? Do you want to try it out? You tell the story and we make the choice, right? It sounds very interesting." An older inspector asked, "But how do you determine if we can do something or not?" "You have to follow the rules of the tabletop game and create a character card for yourself," KP answered. "When your character uses each skill, it will be judged by the number of points you put in when building the skill. If the judgment passes, you can think that your character can do this kind of thing, otherwise you can't. The smaller the number of points you throw, the easier it is to succeed, and the larger the number of points you throw, the easier it is to fail." KP took out 2 10-sided dice and smilingly said, "Look, the first one represents a single digit, while the second one represents a 10-digit number. The total is 100 points. If you had 50 points in your skill, you would have succeeded if you rolled 49 points. However, for a newcomer, knowing more was not as useful as experiencing it once. Just now, I've already written down the character cards that you'll be using. Please use them carefully and avoid tearing them." Saying so, he distributed the character cards. But when it came to AI Ching, she didn't take it. Instead, he silently looked at KP in front of him, as if he sensed that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what the problem was. "Aya, your inspiration is quite high." KP smiled and asked, "Is there a problem? Is this a game?" AI Ching asked. KP smiled. "Yes, it's just a game." "Then, how do we know if you're deliberately targeting us players?" AI Ching immediately sensed the biggest loophole. "If you're willing, you can easily create a monster that we can't defeat and a problem that we can't solve, right?" Don't worry, KP, I'm not. I'm everyone's good friend." KP smiled. "Besides, reality speaks louder than words. This world is often more wonderful than I think." Saying so, he put the character card in AI Ching's hand and smiled warmly. "This is your card. You have to treat him gently." AI Ching took the form and looked at it. Then, she froze. "What? You don't understand?" KP curiously came over and looked at the information on the card. "Why sure, male class. Ascendant, strength 15, yup, normal tier 1, constitution 41, a bit too high, but his intelligence is only 23 and his inspiration is so high that he's on the verge of madness. His luck is only 1, unlucky guy. His skills, on the other hand, are decent exploratory. Detect and listen are 85, charm and sneak are 90, and his deception skills are really high. AI Ching suddenly put away the character card, preventing him from continuing to reveal her information. Aya, you've already noticed the interesting part of this game? KP nodded in admiration and then suggested, it's quite difficult to use this character card well. Do you want me to give you another one? No need. AI Ching shook her head and refused. This card is good. KP didn't say anything else. He turned around and answered the other people's questions. But when he was explaining some attribute information, he seemed to have noticed that AI Ching and the old inspector were listening attentively, so he raised his voice slightly. Soon, the busy explanation came to an end. KP clapped his hands happily and looked at the players in front of him. Since everyone is familiar with their cards, let's start importing, KP said in a deep voice. KP said in a low voice, the time is 16:20. The background is on the vast sea. There is a ship called Mayflower. Following his words, on the blank paper in front of him, line after line of words quickly appeared. The stage has been set, and the heroes have all arrived. The story that revolved around the Philosopher's Stone, the prelude of Son of Original Sin, slowly began. Then, let's start the happy 3 weeks. Your name is Huai Shi, and you are a down-and-out musician, a cello player that no one cares about. After losing your noble patron, you wandered around Rome, living a poor life, and yearned for the rumored new world full of gold, dreaming of getting rich overnight. One day, you received a mysterious letter. A theater from the New World heard of your superb performance skills, and couldn't wait to invite you to the New World to become the chief musician of their theater. They offered you a wonderful salary and share dividends, and the letter also included 500 lire and a ship ticket. With no other choice, you decided to seize this opportunity. On the day of the appointment, you came to the dock, and unexpectedly met a few friends in the tavern. Import begins. In a trance, Huai Shi seemed to hear someone talking in his ear, and it sounded annoying, and it didn't sound like a good thing. But soon, he woke up from his dizziness. The carriage arrived at the destination. The dilapidated dock was filled with mud and the stench of garbage. Huai Shi struggled to carry his luggage and walked into a bar where he could rest. Why do I want to go to a bar? Isn't the hotel next to it more comfortable? Forget it, I'll go to the bar. In the noisy crowd, he pulled his luggage and sat at the bar. He wanted to say something to the bartender, but his mind was blank, and he didn't know what to order. Other than the Cowherd nightclub, he had never been to a place where he wanted to drink. He wanted to say something. Can I have a glass of milk? Cowherd nightclub? What is that? Have I been to that kind of place? While he was still in shock, he suddenly heard a familiar female voice in his mind. Whiskey. This strange flash of inspiration made Huai Shi feel relieved, and he said to the bartender, "A glass of whiskey, thank you." So, a glass of whiskey was served, and suddenly someone called his name. Huai Shi? Is that you? When Huai Shi turned around in surprise, he saw a group of passengers sitting around the table. There were several familiar faces that he had some impressions of when he was wandering. Old Xiao, a boiler worker who had lost his job, Lei Feizhou, a bodyguard who didn't have a good reputation in the industry, Clement, a knight with tuberculosis. The 5 people at the table were all people he had met before. And it seemed that they were also passengers who wanted to take the ship. Was this fate? It was too strange. A few people who hadn't seen each other for a long time sat together, and after talking about the recent situation with each other, a rare friendship suddenly appeared between them, and their relationship gradually warmed up. And in the middle of the conversation, a voice sounded not far away. A rickety homeless man with disheveled hair limped forward in the bar, holding a broken bowl in his hand, and begged in a low voice, "Do a good deed, sir, do a good deed." But no one lowered the curtain. The old tramp walked over to the table full of expectation and looked at them. Lei Feizhou frowned in disgust and glared at him. "Get out of my way, old ghost. Do you want to be beaten?" The sound of dice could be vaguely heard. The homeless man seemed to be frightened and staggered back. He looked pitiful. Huai Shi sighed and waved his hand, indicating for him to come over. The homeless man, as if he had been pardoned, walked around in a big circle, took Lei Feizhou's line of sight, and moved to Huai Shi's side, holding the bowl with a flattering smile. "Help me, sir, God will bless you, help me." Huai Shi took out his wallet, rummaged through it, found a few coins, and threw them into the bowl. The homeless man seemed to be crazy with joy, gratefully holding his hand and thanked incoherently. "Thank you, kind sir, thank you, God will bless you, God will bless you." There was another faint sound of dice, as if the table next door was gambling. Huai Shi looked over curiously, but suddenly felt a small thing being stuffed into his sleeve. The homeless man smiled mysteriously, turned and left. Huai Shi subconsciously clenched his hand, stunned. He was about to ask something when he heard the sound of a steam whistle in the distance. The ship set sail. But was there really such a huge ship in this era? Huai Shi stood at the dock, staring blankly at the brightly lit steel ship, stunned. It was difficult to connect such a magnificent creation with the bumpy, shabby, and dirty wooden ships in his impression. How is this 1620? In a strange sense of dissonance, he spat out words that even he didn't know what they meant. This is 2020. Chapter 120. Jinling, late at night. In the quiet office, a middle-aged man with white hair drank tea in silence as he watched the rain fall outside. There was a hurried knock on the door. Soon, a young man drenched in sweat walked in and glared at him. "Director Meng, what's the deal with the Philosopher's Stone retrieval mission? Didn't I say I'd go?" "You don't need to worry about this, little Hai," Director Meng replied. "Someone else has already taken over." "That's it. What the hell is that, KP?" The ascendant named Nehai opened his eyes wide. "The area on the high seas has already been bordered. It's possible that the retrieval team will be wiped out." Director Meng's expression was still calm. "It's probably because the records in the fragment have been activated. But after a rank 5 ascendant dies, their memories will remain in the fragment. If it's handled properly, it might be a rare trial for them. Perhaps they'll be able to find some useful talents. But if it's handled, it should be me, right?" Nehai opened his eyes wide. "Why are you handing it over to someone else? Is this a request from the Social Security Bureau?" "This is a joint decision from the Social Security Bureau and the Sky Culture Society." Director Meng muttered to himself for a moment before pointing at the chair in front of him, indicating for him to sit down. "I know you're angry that you've been called back halfway, and I understand that you're worried that something unexpected will happen. But I can guarantee you that this matter will be handled properly." "Because of that KP?" Nehai frowned. One of the rulers of the borderline dark net suddenly came to the present. "Isn't there something wrong with this matter? Why would he be interested in a fragment of the Philosopher's Stone?" "Who knows?" Director Meng said indifferently. "The key is that he offered a price. The higher-ups agreed, and the Social Security Bureau didn't have any objections. That's enough. Moreover, as far as I know, even though KP has a lot of bad tastes, he's one of the most outstanding creators in the world. With him combing through the records, there won't be any mistakes. You also don't need to worry about a new quarantine zone." "But what about the enforcers and inspectors?" "KP has already been guaranteed, but it's inevitable that there will be losses." Director Meng stared at the night sky outside the window and couldn't help but sigh. Even though their lives won't be in danger, they'll definitely be toyed with by that guy's bad taste. It took a lot of effort to board the ship. It started to drizzle, and the passengers who had been waiting for a long time could no longer listen to the sailors' shouts. They were too lazy to line up and squeeze their way onto the ship. For a moment, Huai Shi was pushed back and forth in the crowd and staggered forward. He vaguely heard a scream and felt something strange under his feet. He lowered his head and found that he had stepped on a white handkerchief, dirtying the golden embroidered letter H on the corner. He bent down to pick it up and looked around. he noticed that the cloaked person in front of him had turned back to look at him. His eyes were cold, but through the hood and the dim light, he could see the delicate side of his face. A strand of silver hair fell from her ear, which was particularly eye-catching. "Give it back." She reached out and snatched her handkerchief from Huai Shi's hand. Then, she turned around and left. Huai Shi was pushed several times by the people behind him and staggered forward. Finally, under the guidance of the crew, they came to the guest area. After a few friends chose their rooms, they agreed to meet again at dinner. Huai Shi walked into the room and closed the door. After putting away his luggage, he finally opened his palm and looked at the thing that the homeless man had stuffed into his hand. It was a coin. The ordinary Roman copper coin was carved with exquisite patterns and carefully carved with the image of an angel. On the back there was a cross-shaped engraving. The symbol of the Holy Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was delicately carved around it. It looked like a work of art. A homeless coin. A popular trick among bankrupt merchants, homeless people, and unemployed farmers during the industrial era. These homeless people hoped to carve the coin more beautifully in exchange for more money from the almsgivers who took pity on them. Or, simply out of boredom. Such an explanation inexplicably appeared in his mind, and made him feel particularly uncomfortable. He bent down and, as if by coincidence, opened his luggage along with everyone in the other guest rooms. Then, he froze in place. Time stood still. Import ended. "Okay, everyone's acting is good." KP applauded with joy. It seems that everyone has the potential to become an outstanding investigator. Then, let's keep up the good work. Ai Qing didn't say anything. The strong sense of contradiction and disharmony became more and more intense. It made her feel as if she had forgotten something, or as if she had overlooked something. But KP didn't give her more time to think. "Ah, I forgot to say." KP patted his head as if he suddenly realized something. "Our group is a secret group. That is to say, each character card actually has its own secret and purpose. Once exposed, it may lead to an unusually bad situation." As he spoke, he took out a stack of envelopes and distributed them to all the inspectors participating in the game. "Based on your different choices and performances in the import module, I have arranged different identities and secrets for everyone." KP smiled happily. "I hope that while everyone protects their own secrets, we can cooperate sincerely to complete the module's goal, successfully reaching the new world." In that instant, Huai Shi came to a sudden realization. He saw the contents of the suitcase. Dozens of bottles filled with various items, an exquisite and ferocious-looking crossbow, several test tubes filled with scarlet liquid, 2 daggers, a short knife, and a heavy weapon hanging from the top of the suitcase on a hook. It was a silver-plated hand axe with gorgeous and exquisite spells engraved on the back of the axe. He could vaguely see the faint blood color that had seeped into it. Just by looking at it, he knew that it had amazing lethality. "But I'm a cello player. Why do I have these things?" At that moment, he looked at the coin in his hand again. His fingers seemed to move on their own, causing the coin to constantly flip on his fingertip. Then, the cross mark and the angel's icon appeared in reverse. It was like the key to opening the seal and unlocking the shackles in his mind. In an instant, countless memories emerged from the darkness and poured into his mind. Find that person, follow that person, and then kill that person. A majestic and old voice sounded in his ear. "At all costs, Van Helsing, at all costs, let that blasphemer's work, let that deformed child who will only tarnish God's achievements be smashed to pieces." He finally remembered. Huai Shi was just his disguise. His real identity was an executioner cultivated by the Holy Spirit genealogy. Judge Hunter, impure Judas. There were many titles, whether praise or derogatory, that fell on the shoulders of people like him because he was a dark creature cultivated by the church to clean up the dark creatures. He was a heretic created to kill heretic. The ascendant who bore the third-order stigmata vampire. Demon Hunter Van Helsing. For more than a year, he had been carrying out the mission issued by the bishop, to hunt down the pagan alchemist Paracelsus. In order to find clues, he had almost traversed the whole of Rome, following clues, and finally arrived on this ship. As for the identity of Huaishur, it was just a disguise he had chosen to use to get on the ship. That unlucky cellist had long been abandoned in the wilderness. He had to kill the heretic before the ship arrived at the New World, and then return from the New World. In an instant, he recalled the cause and effect, but he felt more and more absurd in his heart. No, something was wrong. "I'm not Huaishur," he whispered softly. "I'm Van Helsing? I'm a cellist? I'm a musician? I'm a demon hunter? I'm Huaishur? I'm Van Helsing? Who am I?" At that moment, he subconsciously groped for the suitcase, trying to find more about himself. Finally, he touched something that did not originally exist in the suitcase. No, it did not even exist in this story. A book? No, it looked more like a diary. When he opened the title page, countless electric lights flashed in his mind, crisscrossing, tearing through the layers of fog and deliberately created darkness, and suddenly illuminating the whole situation. Countless broken records finally pieced together again, forming a complete track. "I'm Huaishur," he groaned from the pain in his head, as if he had finally woken up from the deepest part of a nightmare. Even so, he was still trapped in the nightmare. He could feel the part of Van Helsing that existed in his body, bringing with it a burst of thirst for blood. Now, his body had become a demon hunter with the rank 3 vampire stigmata. Whether it was the indescribable thirst or the mission that seemed to be engraved in the stigmata that he could not violate, it all proved this. But what was going on? Did he suddenly transmigrate? What the hell? What happened? Why did he come here inexplicably? A series of question marks kept emerging in his mind, and he finally became aware of the wall hidden behind his consciousness, as well as a confused gaze overlooking from somewhere. Ai Ching? At that moment, on the cargo ship, Ai Ching felt a sudden headache. As if there was a chain reaction, with Huaishur's awakening, the shackles imposed on her head also loosened and cracked open a gap. A second inspector has noticed the effect of cognitive interference so soon? KP slowly turned back and smiled helplessly. It's not good to have too much inspiration and intuition. No, to some extent, the two of you are a perfect match. It was as if she had been isolated in another world for a moment. KP was still narrating the story and explaining the rules to others, but at the same time, his eyes were looking at her as if he had split into another person, looking at Ai Ching's confused expression. Soon, the faint intuition turned into a flash of inspiration, breaking through the sealed memory. She woke up from her trance and obsession and knew where she was. There was no need to hesitate. At that moment, Ai Ching instinctively drew her gun and pulled the trigger. Chapter 121. At that moment, Ai Ching instinctively pulled out her gun and pulled the trigger. KP snapped his fingers. So what came out of the muzzle was no longer bullets, but rather festive ribbons and flowers. Calm down, Ma-am, I believe most problems can be solved through conversation. KP shrugged. Presumably, you also have a lot of questions to ask, right? Ai Ching frowned and looked at him coldly. Are you going to answer? KP shrugged helplessly. Believe me, even if you know more, it will only increase the difficulty for you. And to a certain extent, I saved you guys. I will judge the situation myself, Mr. KP. Ai Ching said coldly. What is going on? What is wrong with my memory? Don't worry, it is only temporary amnesia caused by the time jump. KP shrugged. To put it simply, due to the Philosopher's Stone being mistakenly triggered, a mutation occurred. In order to avoid the formation of a quarantine zone in the present world, I could only forcibly turn this place into a part of the dark net. Regrettably, in the process, all of them were swept into the records of the Philosopher's Stone, the historical fragments of 1620. In order to remedy this, I had to start this game. Like I said, when necessary, I will provide assistance to you. Then let's end this game. AI Ching said coldly, pull them back. Sorry, although the dark net is a virtual world, it still has its own rules. KP shook his head and refused. His smile was even more unpleasant. Even if it is me, I can't do as I please. The game has already started, AI Ching. If you can't clear the game as the host, I am afraid I can't provide much help. AI Ching sneered. So, you deliberately created all this just to play a game with us? Exactly. KP nodded solemnly and asked matter-of-factly, isn't the game gentler than reality? I just provided you with a way to solve the problem. You see, I've successfully turned the records in the Philosopher's Stone into a game. In other words, once you clear this game, you can successfully store the Philosopher's Stone. Or are you saying that you would rather abandon such a logical and simple solution and choose to face a chaotic situation that you know nothing about? AI Ching shook her head indifferently. No, you're just like the Lord God described by those boring writers. You like the feeling of toying with people in the palm of your hand. Although their natures are about the same. KP didn't deny it. He just shrugged. But the situation is stronger than the person, right? AI Ching lowered her head and turned the pistol with flowers in her hand. After a long time, she suddenly said, but I can at least refuse. If you die, what will happen to your officers? KP asked curiously. From what I can see, you don't seem like an irresponsible person. So, I must play the game? Unfortunately, yes. KP chuckled. Now that things have come to this, why not enjoy the fun of the game? If you ask me, there's no need to be so serious and hardcore. Relax a little and treat it as an exploration-type computer game. After a short silence, AI Ching suddenly said, I want to talk to Huaishur. KP was stunned for a moment. He scratched his head in astonishment. Are you sure? Using a character card that's out of your control isn't a good choice for the game. If you ask me, it's not too late for you to change to the NPC card. AI Ching was expressionless. I insist. KP was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he showed an expectant smile. Very well, I'll make an exception for your request. But at the same time, I want to add a rule. When Huaishur is appraising his rationality, you'll be appraising it at the same time. And when Huaishur's HP is deducted. There was no need to say anything else. AI Ching nodded silently. Wonderful. KP waved his hand and laughed excitedly. Then do your best, Miss AI. I'm looking forward to what kind of story can be created with an excellent player like you and an excellent character like Mr. Hui. At that moment, darkness suddenly descended. Huaishur saw the girl sitting opposite him. 10 minutes later, Huaishur finally understood the specific situation. At the same time, he was even more confused. In other words, when we encountered an abnormal change, in order to avoid the situation from becoming serious, KP directly created an instance on the spot and pulled us in, right? AI Ching nodded. Huaishur felt more and more puzzled. Strange, too strange. After reading the Book of Destinies for so many years, Huaishur had some experience as a reader. But according to the usual plot rules, shouldn't this kind of truth be hinted at by a lot of foreshadowing first, and then thrown out as a breaking point after I've explored the dungeon? Why was it given so readily at the beginning? Moreover, what made Huaishur even more uneasy was, are you sure he mentioned the record? AI Ching nodded. She didn't understand why he was so obsessed with this kind of wording. Huaishur's heart was half heavy and half relaxed. He was relaxed because the Book of Destiny was not recorded on the character card. In other words, AI Ching still didn't know that he had such a dangerous thing on him. And he was heavy because he felt that KP seemed to have some kind of connection with the Book of Destiny. But at present, although KP had created a lot of trouble, he didn't directly harm him. Instead, he was quite active in pushing these players to clear this ridiculous game. He couldn't understand these brain-burning things no matter how much he thought about it. He left it to AI Ching. Present, Huai Shi began to focus on the most important thing. Now, the most important thing for us is to complete the character's goal and then clear this instance, right? Huai Shi rubbed his hands and nodded. Okay, I'll go find old Xiao and the others later and see if we can work together. Can you not be so fast? AI Ching calmly reminded him, Mr. Van Helsing. Huai Shi was stunned. He finally reacted. Now Huai Shi had become his avatar, and Demon Hunter Van Helsing had become his real identity, an unspeakable secret. In this instance, everyone had a secret. In other words, everyone might have different goals under the premise of reaching the new world. His goal was to kill Paracelsus, who was hiding on the ship. What about the others? Maybe they wanted to protect him? Or to be more straightforward, they wanted to find Van Helsing on the ship and kill him. It was even possible that some people directly became Paracelsus. This was the most disgusting thing about secret. You couldn't be sure if the other party was harmful to you, but you couldn't completely trust them. In other words, not only can we not be united, but we also have to be on guard against each other within the team. Huai Shi scratched his head a little irritably. Because of the existence of the traitor, I'm afraid we can only be friends on the surface and fight alone in the dark, right? Not only that. AI Ching knocked on the wheelchair's armrest and told him the last piece of bad news. Except for Huai Shi, the other characters were directly controlled by the other supervisors. In other words, the others were one with the game card, but their team was separated from the game account. One person became two. It sounded good, but in fact, it was not necessarily an advantage. On the contrary, it could be a disadvantage. This was true for both Huai Shi and AI Ching, especially when the two of them had different opinions. Of course, Huai Shi could do whatever he wanted, but most of the time, the necessary points had to be cast by AI Ching herself. In the silence, AI Ching rubbed her throbbing forehead and sighed softly. Is trust the only thing we can rely on? It feels like this kind of thing doesn't exist at all. Don't be so pessimistic, bro. Huai Shi was stunned. Aren't we working together seamlessly? AI Ching asked back. Do you mean you're going to do the dirty work and I'm going to help you clean up? Huai Shi was speechless. Well, although it's not right to do this, at least give me a little trust in this kind of life or death matter, okay? I'll try. After pondering for a moment, AI Ching opened her mouth to say something, but in the end, she still didn't say anything. Instead, she took the initiative to change the topic. I'll give you instructions in the next exploration, but during the operation, be careful of what's hidden on this ship. She suspected that there were definitely some secrets hidden on this ship. Who knew how many traps were hidden in the so-called import process alone? First, there was the mysterious letter, then the sudden secret after boarding the ship, and finally the final condition of the game, to reach the new world. Whose letter was it? What was the point of this inexplicable secret other than causing internal strife? Also, in 1620, sitting on a cruise ship that was at least 400 years ahead of its time, was there still a need to worry about getting lost at sea? Or rather, was there a possibility of not being able to reach the destination? If one could safely clear the game just by lying in the room, wouldn't that be too ridiculous? AI Ching put herself in KP's shoes and guessed KP's thoughts. She could come to a conclusion that she was completely sure of. There was definitely a ghost on this ship. Even if they didn't hit an iceberg, they would definitely encounter something irresistible. As for the classic plot that would play out in the enclosed environment of Blizzard Villa, it was simply needless to say. Before reaching the new world, there would definitely be a lot of trouble. The more likely possibility was that, if the investigators didn't unite, it was likely that they would all die before they reached the new world. No matter what the situation was, it was unpleasant. AI Ching bit her finger. With the end of the conversation, the darkness dissipated, and AI Ching once again returned to her original position. It was as if time had stopped in place and waited for her. After she reappeared, it continued to move forward slowly. The others were still unaware of what had happened. KP's smiling face reappeared in front of them. The time in the secret room is over. How do you feel? AI Ching didn't answer. Instead, she asked, I remember you said that this is a very popular game on the darknet, right? That's right. KP smiled. Everyone loves to play it, young and old alike. So, AI Ching raised her head and stared at his expression. Then, as a player, it's not against the rules if I want to read the rulebook, right? KP raised his eyebrows in surprise. He didn't say anything and just waved his hand and snapped his fingers. Bang! A thick stack of books suddenly appeared in front of AI Ching. They were piled up on the table to a height of 40 centimeters. The handwriting on the cover was even more varied. In addition to the common English, Latin, and Dongxia language, there were also small categories such as Yingzhou language. As you wish, Ms. AI. He smiled. All the rules of the 6th edition, plus the house rules, as well as the expanded rules of martial arts adopted this time. I hope you can finish reading before the game ends. But now, the tender time is over. KP snapped his fingers. The game officially began. Chapter 122. Huai Shi was taking inventory of his belongings. There was still half an hour before dinner. He had to at least figure out what kind of situation he was in and what other things he had on him. A coat, a replaceable leather lining, a change of pants and a shirt, a copy of the Holy Book, written by the Holy Spirit genealogy, a wanderer coin, and 345 copper coins, which could be exchanged for 30 silver coins. These were all miscellaneous items. Then there was a set of small alchemy equipment, a box full of green solidified grease, with 14 throwing knives that could be thrown at any time. It seemed that the green was not a good thing. A crossbow that could be installed on the inside of the arm. If he wore a coat, it would not be visible. 2 daggers carved with holy words, a short knife that could be tied to the calf. These were all just taken inventory. There were about 16 test tubes filled with scarlet liquid. Huai Shi tried to open them and smell them. He felt that the thirst in his lungs had greatly reduced and was even full of freshness. But he was full of desire for the liquid in the test tubes. Alchemy concentrated plasma. In addition to being a daily consumable, it could also be said to be a silver blood potion for vampires. As long as there was enough blood, he could quickly recover from his injuries. When necessary, he could also use the 2 tubes of blood with the silver mark. The plasma was mixed with slightly cool silver nitrate, archaea, and other drugs to create a strong stimulant. Apart from that, Huai Shi finally noticed the 16 small bottles. After opening them and sniffing them, she discovered that they were filled with sword oils of different colors. There were also different labels on them, the insignia of different dark creatures. In other words, these were highly toxic poisons created for various monsters. It could only be said that Van Helsing's business was too skilled and professional. And the most important thing that Huai Shi checked was the hand axe that he was very familiar with. Even the weight and feel of it were the same. The purification runes on it made up for the lack of source material. It was a rare weapon, and even its sturdiness was not inferior to the border relics. The only drawback was that it was not very convenient to take and carry. However, Huai Shi could at least hide it in his piano case. It would be great if it could be used like the Axe of Wrath. After entering the Instance dungeon, his soul power had disappeared. It was understandable that soul power represented the essence of every sublimator. If KP could keep the stigmata of Van Helsing and give him soul power at the same time, wouldn't it mean that he could control sublimators at any time? And this might not be a bad thing. Huai Shi had already entered the mindset of a traitor. After all, he was only Tier 1. Even if he had it, its usefulness would be limited. And if he couldn't use it, no one else could. Everyone was on the same level roughly. However, Huaisher didn't know the identity of the others and what kind of stigmata they were given. Now, Huaisher had begun to familiarize himself with the vampire stigmata. Fortunately, vampires, like ghosts, were agile and relied on speed and reflexes to carry out high-speed attack. If there was an auxiliary or heavy defense type, Huaisher would be completely at a loss. Van Helsing's experience with weapons and the stigmata seemed to have been preserved along with the command that was almost engraved in his soul. After a little exercise, Huaisher had miraculously mastered the speed and reflexes that were far beyond his previous limit. Now, he was able to jump nimbly in the narrow cabin of the ship without making a sound. Not only could he easily jump on the bed, deck, walls, and tables, he could even easily jump on the back of a chair. His weight seemed to have disappeared as he turned into a black shadow and quickly bounced around the room. Even the specific outline could not be seen, only a vague trajectory. What was even more surprising was that such a high-speed movement did not even cause a gust of wind. With a wave of Huaisher's hand, several cold lights flew out from his hands and sleeves and quietly sank into the table without even the slightest sound. Huaisher looked at his masterpiece in amazement, frightened by the performance just now. A complete assassination type. How much effort did Van Helsing put in to hone this skill? But if one carefully recalled, it was not difficult to understand where this guy's fanatical sense of mission came from. Just like the Red Gloves, this guy was completely a tool created by the Church. In order to eliminate dark creatures, they created dark creatures, and in order to cultivate executioners to kill, but in a dignified name. Ever since Van Helsing learned to read and write in the Holy Church, his teacher began to tell him, "Everyone has original sin, but some people are deeply sinful, such as you and me. Only piety is the road to salvation. Only by putting this piety into action can the world become better and better. Only by making greater sacrifices can this original sin be forgiven." In the pedigree of the Holy Ghost Church, there was the dark side of this original sin. Even if they were believers in the first stage, they would begin to part ways in the second stage. By swallowing the golden apple given by paradise, they would jump to another path of sublimation and become impure, and then they would be specially trained to become executioners to vampires. Only when the Church felt that their sins had been redeemed would they be given a holy object to advance and be redeemed. And in Van Helsing's memory, the upper stigmata of vampires turned out to be the angel of authority. It seemed that the Holy Ghost Church's pedigree was very deep. It was indeed a behemoth that once occupied the entire West. If it had not split, it would have been worthy of being called the first pedigree. Time flew by quickly as he was thinking and organizing his items. When the bell finally rang, Huaisher, who had dressed up as a cello player, walked out of the room again and happened to bump into Old Shao, Lei Feizhou, and Yu Jun. But he did not see Anai Heng and Clement. Without the direct supervisor to control him, Clement had become an NPC and could not be considered an ally. It was not strange that they did not see him, but it was surprising that Anai Heng was missing. Did that guy go out early? After knocking on the door a few times, there was no response. At this time, more and more people were in the corridor. They looked at each other tacitly, and Old Shao took the lead and walked in front. "Let's go to the restaurant first. It seems that the restaurant is where the characters will appear. I'm afraid there will be some important plot." Huaisher still pretended to be controlled by AI Qing and listened to the instructions from AI Qing in his mind. He followed closely behind and did not have any opportunity to say anything flirtatious or cause trouble. Why did it feel like he had lost something? As they moved forward, the number of other passengers increased, but there was a heavy pressure between them. Although most of them looked calm, one could vaguely see a trace of distress or panic like birds startled by the twang of a bow. This feeling of abnormality became more and more obvious when they reached the restaurant. Huaisher could not help but frown. As far as the eye could see, not a single smile could be seen on any of their faces. Perhaps it was just a layer of fake polite smiles. Most of them were deeply worried and full of apprehension. There were even more people whose faces were filled with impatience and viciousness, causing others to be unwilling to approach them. The whole restaurant was immersed in a gloomy atmosphere. It was as if a storm was coming. Even if they were talking by chance, everyone was trying to lower their voices, as if they were afraid that someone would overhear them. Why is it so gloomy? Huai Shi was stunned and almost could not hold back his usual silly smile. Ruining the atmosphere was not a big deal, but when everyone was worried, if he was the only one who was happy, wouldn't he attract a circle of hatred? Didn't you pay attention to the background of your character card? He heard Ai Qing's reminder. And the identities of old Xiao and the others. A poor cellist who had lost his sponsor, a worker who had lost his job, and a bodyguard who had a bad reputation in the industry who could not find an employer. It seemed that everyone's identity was not the high-spirited type. Instead, they were all unlucky and tragic. Even if they had a chance to go to a new world, who knew what was waiting for them in that unknown world? Therefore, it was reasonable for him to put on a distressed face. But these people, this means one thing. Ai Qing said indifferently. We are not the only ones who received the mysterious letter. It is even possible that everyone on this ship was invited by various mysterious letters. Huai Shi sucked in a cold breath. Just as he was looking left and right, he suddenly heard a sharp and old voice. How many times do I have to tell you before you will listen? It was stolen. My little baby was stolen. A heartbroken old woman grabbed the crew and shouted in a sharp voice. The person who stole my sweetheart must be hiding among these bumpkins. It must be. The old man was obviously different from other passengers. He was dressed luxuriously, and his fingers and neck were wearing expensive jewelry. When he spoke, he revealed a sense of arrogance. Obviously, his identity was not ordinary. Relax, my sister. An old man next to her persuaded in a hoarse voice. He was sitting in a wheelchair. It seemed that he was too old to move. His tone was weak. Maybe Bobby just went out to play temporarily. No one here will steal your pet. Shut up, you old trash. If you didn't have a brain problem and wanted to go out, how could Bobby get lost? Being humiliated in public by his younger sister, the old man seemed to be used to it. He just sighed tiredly and opened his mouth to say something. However, he coughed violently again, as if his lungs were going to be coughed out. Trembling, he took out a small medicine box from his arms, swallowed a few pills, and gasped with difficulty. Sickly bastard, you can't be of any use. You only know how to eat all day. If it weren't for you, my Bobby. Whoa. The woman with age spots on her face cried when she got emotional. She covered her face and fell on the shoulder of the young man next to her. What should I do, dear? You must help me, my Bobby, my Bobby. Beside her, the handsome young man gently patted her on the shoulder, comforting the heartbroken old man in a soft voice, causing Huai Shi and the others to be dumbfounded. And I hung? Chapter 123. F***ck. Had he hooked up with a rich woman so quickly? If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, Huai Shi would never have believed it. This was the teammate who hadn't met up with them in the hallway. Huai Shi and the others were blinded by his actions. Looking at the lovey-dovey look in his eyes, with only true love in his eyes. That's not right. Are you the prostitute, or am I the prostitute? Wait a minute, I'm not the prostitute either. It seems that he's most likely a yin card. Ai Qing's voice was cold. If my cousin really has the slightest bit of redeeming qualities, then it's probably because he's good at reading people's faces, right? Especially when it comes to pleasing this old thing. He's simply a genius. Let's order first. Old Xiao sighed and withdrew his gaze. Seeing his colleague make his debut as a prostitute so quickly, the supervisor's mood must be very complicated. Not long after, An I-heng, who had reluctantly said goodbye to his girlfriend, returned triumphantly. He seemed to want to show off his communication skills, but when he saw the complicated expressions on his teammates' faces, he immediately curled his lips and said nothing. It was commendable that although the time was 1620, the dishes on the menu were fully compatible with modern times. Even with Huai Shi's blind ordering skills, he was still able to order pretty good dishes. At this time, KP's voice suddenly rang out. Now that almost everyone is here, you can conduct an investigation. Immediately after, Huai Shi heard the sound of dice rolling incessantly, as if KP was judging everyone's investigation skills. Soon, he heard KP's astonished voice. 86. That's shocking. You can't even pass 85 with your investigation points. How lucky are you? Ai Qing didn't say anything. Huai Shi's vision blurred, and then he realized that the restaurant was so crowded that he couldn't see anything. He mourned silently in his heart. With a dice roll of 100 points, he could have succeeded if he rolled within 85 points, but in the end, he just missed by a little. What was with his bad luck? Fortunately, old Xiao and the others would not hide such information. Under their guidance, Huai Shi soon noticed a few people who were almost conspicuous among the many tourists. Well, it was eye-catching in the eyes of others, but in Huai Shi's eyes it was ordinary. In the middle of the restaurant, a young man with bronze skin sat on a table filled with various dishes. His face was painted with faint golden patterns, as if he came from Egypt. Even though he was sitting in front of the table, he didn't touch the food at all. Instead, he placed his fat cat on the table and allowed it to eat as much as it wanted. In the entire restaurant, it seemed that only the young man's smile came from his heart, relaxed and happy. Right after that was the quarreling pair. No, it should be said that the older brother was being reprimanded by the older brother. Both of them seemed to be of high birth. Their postures during the meal were quite elegant and graceful. The older brother, who was so old that all his teeth had fallen out, could no longer eat. He could only take small bites of porridge and thick soup. The younger sister, on the other hand, was not afraid of greasy food and had an amazing appetite. What was left was a table of seemingly united husband and wife. The wife had heavy makeup that could not cover up the dusty aura of a prostitute, while the husband was as ugly as a goldfish with big eyes. His face was abnormally pale. Finally, there was Clement, who sat silently in the corner, staring blankly at the waves outside the window. He did not say a word, nor did he eat anything. I'm afraid these are the important plot characters. Old Xiao pondered for a moment before saying, "What do you think of the secret that KP told you?" "Don't talk." Ai Qing's voice suddenly sounded in Huai Shi's ears. "Look at the others' expressions." The dice rolled. Ai Qing used the detection skill. In an instant, Huai Shi had a panoramic view of the changes in everyone's expressions. Old Zhao's expression was calm, as if he already had a plan. Lei Feizhou's expression became vigilant. Yu Jun's eyes were curious. Only Ni Heng or Yin Yan's character card showed a trace of resistance and unhappiness. There was no doubt that old Xiao was also scrutinizing everyone's expressions, but Huai Shi was like a clay puppet, her face calm and unresponsive. He looked unfathomable. "TSK, old Zhao's inspector beat us to it." Ai Qing glanced at the calm old inspector. She suspected that he was the first person KP said to have noticed the cognitive impairment. She had intended to raise this question first to take the initiative, but she was one step too slow and was beaten to it. "What's the use? He can make a basic judgment," Ai Qing explained. "Putting old Xiao aside, Lei Feizhou is more sensitive to this issue. It can be determined that his secret is more important. The secret of Yu Jun's inspector is relatively unimportant. However, Yin Yan's reaction is quite interesting. Just don't say anything. Let's see what old Xiao has to say next. I don't mean to pry into everyone's secrets. On the contrary, I think it's right to hold back before we can be sure that we can trust each other." Old Xiao continued, however, this module requires us to work together to clear it. I think that before that, why don't we all reveal some relatively insignificant information to build trust? What do you think? Yin Yen frowned. What do you want to ask? The stigmata. Old Xiao said slowly. Everyone's stigmata won't reveal any secrets, right? Besides, if we want to work together, this is also basic information, right? If you want to keep it a secret, just don't reveal your inherent skills and talents. There was a moment of silence. Should we? Huaishur asked. Ai Qing's tone was calm. Never be the first to eat crabs. Let others go first. You just need to watch Old Xiao. It's not that easy to gain something without risking anything. In the silence, Old Xiao was still calm. Seeing that no one spoke, he could only take the lead. Mine is a third-order stigmata, Stitcher. Stitchers, collectively known as Frankenstein, were a new type of stigmata born after combining alchemy and tombstone pedigree. They had existed for less than 500 years and belonged to a relatively obscure type. However, the main enhancement should be the basic attributes of the body. In short, high defense and health. As for the rest, Old Xiao did not reveal. As he spoke, Old Xiao rolled up his sleeves, revealing the stitches on his arm and 2 patches of skin with completely different skin tones. This proved that he was telling the truth. Old Xiao was the first to be frank. Then, Yu Jun, who had been inconspicuous until now, was the first to respond. He said his stigmata. Third-order headless horseman. This was quite a famous stigmata. There was no need to explain too much. As he spoke, Yu Jun pulled down his collar, revealing the ring-shaped scar on his neck. Then, Lei Feizhou popped out 5 slender and sharp claws, which were as sharp as blades, and quickly put them away. Third-order werewolf. In the end, only Yin Yen and Huaishur were left. Sensing Huaishur's gaze, Yin Yen suddenly became angry. Why are you looking at me? You should say it first. Since you've already spoken, why don't you say it first? Huaishur asked. Are you afraid that I won't tell you after hearing it? Yin Yen was speechless for a moment. After a long time, he said unhappily, Third-order red hat. As he spoke, his figure blurred and became translucent in an instant. The red hat, which was the original form of the legendary goblins and other monsters, was best at sneak attacks, stealing and hiding. When he was invisible, even most equipment and Tier 3 sublimators could not see through him. It could be said that he was a stigmata with the ability to survive. However, everyone else was at Tier 3, while he was the only one at Tier 2. This made him feel extremely embarrassed. After speaking, he angrily glared at Huaishur. What about you? Don't run away after hearing it. His angry expression contained a trace of expectation, as if he was hoping that Huaishur was at Tier 1, which was lower than him. Huaishur smiled slightly. Just as he was about to speak, he heard Ai Qing's voice. Don't tell the truth. Tell them that you're a Tier 3 evil spirit from the Nordic lineage. Even though he was confused, Huaishur didn't disobey. Instead, he listened to Ai Qing's instructions and reached out to grab Yin Yan's wrist. Yu Jun's icy fingers seemed to give him a fright. He quickly broke free and looked at Huaishur cautiously. What are you trying to do? Prove it. If I don't take some of your origin substance, how can I prove it? Huaishur countered, Do you want me to reveal myself in front of everyone? Actually, according to the legends, evil spirits were souls that possessed humans after they died. Evil spirits and vampires were quite similar in appearance. Their faces were as pale as corpses, their bodies were cold, their auras were sinister, and their eyes were blood-red. Even their combat style was known for its speed and strangeness. The only difference was that one sucked blood while the other sucked souls. They didn't consume the same type of food. As long as Huaishur didn't suck blood in front of everyone, he probably wouldn't be exposed for a long time. And no one at the table dared to let an evil spirit extract their origin substance. What if Huai Shi was a traitor and got high on the origin substance? Who would they complain to? Alright. Everyone, stop arguing. When old Xiao saw that the two of them were about to start fighting, he tried to mediate between them. When the two of them finally quieted down, he made the final conclusion. It seems that everyone's stigmata are all dark creatures? This was the only category that couldn't be hidden, no matter whether it was in terms of appearance or characteristics. Everyone belonged to the evil group in the legends. Why lie? Huai Shi asked quietly. Isn't the possibility of being exposed quite high? Are you stupid? Didn't you hear what old Xiao said just now? Everyone is a dark creature, a dark creature. Don't forget, you're a holy spirit. After Ai Qing's reminder, Huai Shi realized that he was AF King Van Helsing, a demon hunter. Wait, does that mean I'm the traitor? For a moment, he suddenly felt a little scared. When he looked at these people, they looked like thugs and allies that Parasius had found. Besides, old Xiao might be hiding something from you. Ai Qing hinted. A piece of suture, 2 pieces of skin of different colors, doesn't mean anything. Even the stigmata of the stitcher may be a disguise to mislead you. Except for Yu Jun's characteristics, which can't be disguised, everyone else could be lying. Huai Shi's affection for his teammates that had just emerged in his heart instantly cooled down. This was the most disgusting thing about secret. Once suspicions began, everything would become suspicious. Just as he looked elsewhere, full of thoughts, he suddenly heard the sound of dice rolling. KP seemed to have made some judgment. Then, Huai Shi suddenly saw the figure in the corner of the restaurant. The silver-haired girl that he had met when he boarded the ship. And the handkerchief that she carried with her. He vaguely remembered the letters on it, H. Chapter 124. As an alchemy apprentice, although Huai Shi was extremely biased, he still knew a thing or two about the famous people in the history of alchemy. In recent times, it was Newton, one of the most outstanding creators. In old times, it was the oldest scholar, Socrates, and in a slightly earlier period of time, the most famous was undoubtedly his current mission target, Paracelsus, the alchemy grandmaster who was famous for the man-made philosopher's stone. The name Paracelsus was actually his self-proclaimed name, and his real name was stinky and long. Huai Shi only vaguely remembered that the beginning was Phillips, and the ending was Hohenheim. Hohenheim. The beginning letter was H. If this wasn't Hohenheim, then what was it? Could it be Hermes? Ai Qing, I have a bold idea. Please put away your bold idea. Ai Qing said indifferently, this is not a mobile game, nor is it a virtual world. In history, Paracelsus has never changed his gender. Until he was killed by the Holy Ghost Church for tarnishing creationism, he was still a man, and from the portrait, although he was old, he was quite handsome. Huai Shi was stunned for a moment and immediately retorted, maybe he's a crossdresser. Look at her, she still has white hair. Ai Qing seemed to be shocked by his amazing idea, and after a long time, she sighed helplessly. At the entrance of the restaurant, there is a passenger list at the reception desk. You can see her name directly by looking at the table number. Is that so? Huai Shi got up, indicated that he was going to the toilet, and walked to the door. After casually chatting with the waiter there, he lowered his head and glanced at the list on the table. After the dice sounded, he saw a name. Hell? Huai Shi was puzzled. Hell? Ai Qing was silent for a moment and corrected, no, it should be Hela. These two were actually the same name, but the meaning they represented was particularly ominous. The Norse goddess of death, Hela. Maybe it's a fake name? Huai Shi still didn't give up, after all, this name was a bit of an alchemist's style. Ai Qing became more and more helpless. Then what do you want to do? Test it? Huai Shi hesitated for a moment, and then went straight forward, politely stood in front of the table, and greeted the girl who was eating, then reached out and smiled. Hey, hello. KP, I want to charm her. Wait. Ai Qing was stunned. But KP didn't give Huai-Shi a chance to return. He threw the dice for him expectantly. Huai-Shi didn't hide her actions from the other players. In an instant, all eyes were on the two spinning 10-sided dice on the table. The first die 0. Okay, this is a sure. Before Huai-Shi could rejoice, she saw the second die stop. It was still a 0. 0, 0. He felt that this number was not good. Besides, how could he judge 2 zeros? Oh, 2 zeros is 100 points. KP, after a brief moment of astonishment, showed a gloating expression and made the judgment. Congratulations, this is no longer the level of a skill failure, but a big failure. Until now, AI Ching finally flipped to the description of a big failure in the rulebook. No matter how high the skill points were, it was impossible to succeed absolutely. And during the judgment, as long as one rolled 100 points, they would inevitably face the punishment of a big failure. In other words, not only would the player's skill not succeed, but they would also suffer unexpected negative effects because of their own clumsy failure. For example, when unlocking a lock, the tweezers broke and pierced into the flesh. When climbing, the back of the head hit a rock after falling. Simply put, it was like trying to draw a tiger but not a dog. Encountering the player's big failure, KP seemed to be excited and said with a hint of malice, just as Huai-Shi was hitting on this strange lady, he accidentally caught a glimpse of her plate out of the corner of his eye. At that moment, Huai-Shi saw it. In that eerily perfect round vessel, there were countless densely packed slender objects entangled together in a way that defied the laws of physics, forming a strange shadow of non-Euclidean space. And in the darkness between them, a viscous blood-colored liquid slowly seeped out, crazily and slowly drowning the dark green remains. The seemingly reasonable but unimaginable way of composition gave Huai-Shi a strange illusion, as if the crack of the abyss had opened in front of him, choosing to swallow him. In a trance, there was a buzzing in his ears, countless crazy chants sounded chaotically, and in the end, converged into a shuddering scream. Ramen! 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 Finally, KP made a cold judgment. After witnessing this inconceivably cruel scene, Huai-Shi's rationality has decreased by 1. In an instant, Huai-Shi's vision turned black, and he felt a chill soak him, making him almost unable to stand steadily. He was so shocked by the scene in front of him that he almost screamed. AI Ching also felt the same and covered her forehead, moaning in pain. KP, what did she eat? KP showed a pleasant smile. A plate of spaghetti. What the hell spaghetti? For the first time, Huai-Shi was traumatized by a bowl of spaghetti. In a trance, his legs went soft, and he subconsciously held on to the thing in front of him. He finally stood firm and breathed a sigh of relief. Then he realized that the surroundings seemed to have suddenly quieted down. Everyone looked back in astonishment, looking at Huai-Shi's hand, the hand pressing on the girl's chest. Subconsciously, Huai-Shi's 5 fingers contracted. It felt soft. Okay, Huai-Shi said to AI Ching, at least, I can now conclude that she is not a crossdresser. Slap. Huai-Shi's vision turned black, and he was slapped to the ground. The strength of the girl named Hilo was incredible. With one blow, she took 3 HP from Huai-Shi. Huai-Shi only had 24 HP, which was equivalent to being hit in the back of the head with a stick. It was understandable. If it was Huai-Shi, he might have directly kicked this bastard into the sea. Immediately afterward, the girl looked at him coldly, left the table angrily, and left. She just happened to pass by the old captain who was walking in. When Huai-Shi finally got up, he heard the captain's voice on the podium in front of the restaurant. According to the advance instructions of my employer, I need to bring his greetings to you on the first day you board the ship. After taking a sip of wine, the bearded captain put his eyes close to the paper in his hand, and then read the handwriting on it word by word. First of all, thank you for setting off to the New World after receiving my invitation. I will prepare a warm reception in the New World to welcome your arrival. After perfunctorily reading the above words, the captain put away the paper, smacked his lips, and his expression became serious. Next, I will announce a ban. After 9 o'clock tonight, please go back to your rooms to rest. If you need anything, you can ring the bell to summon us, but you are not allowed to go out before 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. You are not allowed to enter the warehouse, and you are not allowed to start a fight. This is the rule set by my employer. Don't ask me why. I don't know why I have to take you poor people to the new world. If you don't want to comply, you can leave this ship at any time and swim back to Rome. I won't force you. He seemed to be dissatisfied with the poor passengers who didn't seem to have anything to gain from them. He put away the paper and turned away, leaving behind a few burly crew members armed with weapons, ready to reason with the passengers who raised different opinions. But the expected riots, complaints, and even protests did not appear. Most people obediently finished their dinner and went to their cabins. Huai Shi and the others looked at each other with a puzzled expression. That's not right. Yin Yen noticed the problem. Since we are not allowed to go out, why is there a rule that we are not allowed to go to the warehouse and not allowed to fight? Several people thought for a while, but they were also puzzled. This was no longer a ban. It was almost like a guide, luring passengers to go to the warehouse in the middle of the night to investigate. And now it seemed that all the passengers on this ship were invited by the mysterious employer? What does he want to do? In the whispered discussion, there were not many people left in the restaurant. Aware of the sailors' eyes, they could only reluctantly get up and go back to the cabin. From 8 o'clock, there was silence outside the cabin, and no sound could be heard. Looking out through the peephole, there was not a single shadow. It seemed like everyone was asleep. This situation lasted until 12 o'clock. Until KP asked, "Okay, it's time to sleep. Does anyone have any other actions? If you don't have enough rest, the next day's judgment will be reduced." The inspectors were silent. They looked at each other and did not speak. Only Yu Jun was stubborn and could not suppress his curiosity. "I want to go out and sneak out to take a look." KP nodded. "What about the others?" The others hesitated, and no one spoke. "Sleep." Huai Shi sighed. "There's everything in dreams." "Okay." KP shrugged regretfully. A moment later, he suddenly said, "Then, except for Yu Jun, if the others are willing, they can vote for extremely hard, which has a 50% success rate." Huai Shi had already fallen asleep on the bed the moment he said sleep. He only vaguely heard the sound of dice. Then, he heard KP's words. "In your sleep, you heard faint screams. This caused your sleep to be exceptionally unsteady. As a result, your HP recovery has decreased a little." What was this? Huai Shi was dumbfounded. An unexpected disaster? Suddenly, a crisp sound rang in everyone's ears, as if paper was being torn. In that instant, Ai Qing suddenly saw Yu Jun's inspector suddenly stiffen and twitch violently. As if he had seen an inconceivable and terrifying shadow, his face contorted in fear, and then, he vomited a large mouthful of blood. Soon, his figure quickly dimmed and disappeared from the table. Yu Jun left. Chapter 125. It wasn't just KP who deliberately blocked their reactions. Except for Ai Qing, who suddenly looked up, the others were still staring at the form on the table, holding the dice in their hands without any reaction. Ai Qing stared at the table and saw the blood Yu Jun spat out before he left. After a long time, she slowly looked up. "They're dead. Don't think of me as such an evil person, madam." KP smiled and looked behind Ai Qing. "After all, I didn't set such harsh rules with others." Ai Qing suddenly looked back and saw two figures on the shabby sofa in the corner of the room. It was Yu Jun and his inspector. They were still alive. But there was nothing left except for being alive. There was no longer any brilliance in his eyes. His pupils were dilated and dull. He just sat on the sofa, motionless, and drool slowly dripped from the corner of his mouth. A walking corpse. See, I told you they're still alive, right? KP smiled. They just lost all their sanity. What's the difference between being alive and being dead? There's a big difference. Compared to the huge price of losing one's life, it's just sacrificing some sanity and losing some dignity. Even if their souls don't collapse, they can find a sanatorium with better conditions and recover in about 5 or 6 years. I think the price I charge is already quite merciful, right? KP glanced at AI Ching's character card indifferently. Compared to others, you need to worry more about yourself. After all, they just lost their sanity when they died, but you… Tisk. AI Ching made a sound of displeasure but didn't say anything. Just as KP was about to continue the game, his phone on the table suddenly vibrated. He picked it up and looked at it, raising his eyebrows. Aya, it seems that many viewers are dissatisfied with this kind of slow game. Viewers? AI Ching frowned. Didn't I say? KP seemed to have just remembered and smiled. This game is being broadcasted live on the border of the dark net. Now the number of viewers worldwide has reached 30,000, and the paid viewers are about to break through 3,000. That's really worth celebrating. There's no need to worry. I've protected everyone's privacy for the time being. It's just that the audience's opinions need to be respected. He pondered for a moment as if he was in a difficult position. After a long time, he sighed helplessly. All right. Let's update the version then. After all, my goal is to let everyone better enjoy the fun of this story, not to dissuade people with tedious numerical calculations and long rulebook. He paused for a moment and revealed his signature smile. Then, let's comply with the audience's demand. From now on, the game would omit the tedious process of casting and judgment, leaving it to the autonomous probability judgment terminal to make the judgment, fully simulating reality. Everything is to give the players and audience the most realistic gaming experience. As he spoke, he snapped his fingers and pitifully announced, "Everyone, the gentle tutorial level is about to end. Next, the game will enter the hard difficulty level." Huai sure fell asleep. Huai sure had a dream. He could clearly feel that he was sinking into darkness and was gradually falling downwards. Pain, cold, hunger, loneliness, despair, and numbness. In this seemingly eternal darkness, countless emotions emerged from his chest as if he was abandoned by the whole world. He couldn't even find an inch of land to keep himself. But in this desperate coldness, a crack seemed to appear in the dark abyss sky. From it, a sacred light shone down. Like a ray of light from a lighthouse, it reflected the figure standing in the deeper darkness. Huai sure couldn't see the face because it was too handsome and solemn. Huai sure couldn't judge his age because there seemed to be the vicissitudes of life and the innocence of a child at the same time. He couldn't even determine the person's gender because that kind of pure beauty seemed to have transcended the category of gender and entered the realm of holiness. His solemn robes were stained with traces of blood that didn't match the color of blood, and it tainted the holiness of his robes. Thus, he fell from paradise and fell into the abyss. But no matter how deep the darkness was, it couldn't stain that pure white crown. As if it was cast from all the light in the world, boundless majesty and brutality adorned it like jewels, stinging every pair of eyes that dared to look at it. In that instant, Huai sure saw that figure slowly raise his eyes and look up at the endless world from the abyss. Thus, the darkness surged like a tide. Countless hoarse voices overlapped, turning into a deafening roar of thunder. Listen, this is the will of the White Crown King. Revere the majesty of the God of the mortal world. It was like the abyss was roaring. The supreme decree is announced here. You only need to listen. This is the destiny of the heavens. You only need to obey. Then, everything froze. It was like the entire world was tamed and listening to the words of that figure. Thus, there was a low and gentle voice. Those calm words echoed in the abyss, stirring up a frenzy like the aftermath of the movement of the stars. Today, I will erect a monument in a barren land. The Supreme White Crown King gave a decree: losers who have not succumbed to adversity and still have a glimmer of hope for the future, if you still have the courage, prove your strength and talent and head to this brand new continent. When the time comes, I will wait here with this rebellious monument for everyone's arrival. Amidst the deathly stillness of time, the Supreme King laughed aloud and declared, "The era that belongs to us is about to arrive." In that instant, Huaishur woke up from his dream. He was sweating profusely. His head hurt faintly and he only felt dizzy. It wasn't just him. All the inspectors suddenly panted violently, and cold sweat seeped out of their foreheads. A faint sound of dice rolling could be heard, forcefully deducting 1 point of rationality from all the players. But what was frightening was that the moment they woke up, the memories in the dream quickly blurred and dissipated. In the end, other than a few fragments in a trance, it was difficult to recall the entire dream. Except for Huaishur. "White Crown King?" Ai Qing asked in disbelief. "Are you sure he called himself the White Crown King?" Huaishur read the records in the Book of Destiny again. "Yes, is he an important person?" Ai Qing asked in return. "Hundreds of years ago, he single-handedly started the great immigration movement and joined forces with the Inca pedigree and other second-rate pedigrees. He started from scratch and created the American pedigree, one of the 6 great pedigrees today. That natural enemy, do you think he's third-rate?" Huaishur was stunned. Immediately, he trembled. He was really trembling. Why did he get involved in such a big shot's matter just by taking in a fragment of the Philosopher's Stone? After he reacted, he finally knew who Ai Qing was talking about. The first fallen morning star in history. The former manager of the Holy Spirit pedigree was said to be a member of the fallen gods. During his most glorious period, his power was extremely great, and he was even known as the deputy ruler of the kingdom of heaven. 1,000 years ago, he was the true master of this world. 1,000 years later, the miracles and changes he created still deeply affected this world. Purely in terms of correction value, he alone could reach more than 30%. 1/3 of the world was turbulent and changed because of him, and under his will, it became what it was today. Even the rise of the Astronomical Society was after him. Compared to such a big shot who was so high that he didn't even know where he was, a newbie like him couldn't even be compared to dust. So, why did he appear here? Now it seemed that the power that led Van Helsing and Paracelsus to the same boat hundreds of years ago in 1620 came from his hand. No, I'm afraid all the passengers were his handiwork. Ai Qing covered her aching forehead and whispered almost like a moan, "It's 1620 now, Huaishur. I should have thought of it, I should have thought of it." Thought of what? She didn't speak again and fell into silence, as if she had entered deeper thought. Soon, Huaishur heard a sharp scream coming from outside the door. Then, it turned into a heartbroken cry. "My Bobby! My Bobby! Ah!" The old woman cried out hoarsely, "Who killed my Bobby? Who? Ah, God, I curse you! I curse you! Your soul will be sealed in the eternal winter of Siberia. Ah, my Bobby! My poor child! Who was so cruel to you?" Huaishur pushed open the door and walked out in shock. She saw that there were already many people in the corridor looking curiously at the old woman who was kneeling and crying in front of the stairs. There was also the mangled corpse in her arms. That was a chicken? Huaishur narrowed his eyes in disbelief. It was indeed a chicken. He could vaguely tell that it was indeed a big rooster that used to be quite handsome and mighty. If it stood up, it would probably be the size of a turkey. But now it was dead, cruelly disemboweled. Huaishur could even tell from Van Helsing's experience that the chicken had been bitten to death, disemboweled, and even its internal organs eaten. So tragic. He couldn't help but whisper, "Did everyone not sleep last night and go to eat chicken on the ship?" It seemed to make sense. Soon, the serious-looking old Shao came over and said to him in a low voice, Yu Jun is missing. Everyone gather in my room later. He left and has now become a retard. Ai Qing said in his mind, Do you need me to describe in detail how he licked the saliva on the ground? Huai Shi was stunned and then frantically refused. Then don't do anything else, Huai Shi, Ai Qing reminded. Also, be careful of old Shao. What's wrong with him? He didn't do much. Ai Qing said, At this time, you have to be careful of anyone who tries to take the initiative. To be exact, everyone. For a moment, he had nothing to say. In the silence, only the old woman's heart-wrenching cries could be heard. But soon, sharp screams came from the deck, and chaos suddenly spread. Someone died. To be exact, all the crew members died. Chapter 126. When Huai Shi and the others rushed to the deck, not a single person could be seen. All the sailors had disappeared. Or rather, they were all dead. Only a handful of pale ashes and a set of 80% new uniforms were left in place. Wait, 80% new? It seemed that the detection skill was quite successful. Huai Shi actually found additional information, such as the age of the uniforms, and even the material of the ashes. Huai Shi put on his gloves, carefully picked up a handful, and sniffed. Thanks to Van Helsing's excellent alchemy, he almost immediately distinguished the composition inside: calcium, carbon, phosphorus, sodium, and so on. Almost all of them were found in the human body. In other words, these were the crewmen's ashes? Huai Shi found it hard to believe that there was some kind of power that could burn all the crewmen to ashes from the inside out in an instant, but it did not leave a single burn mark on the uniforms. It could be seen that these guys basically did not have any reaction or struggle before they were burned to ashes in an instant. And it was done with all of them, otherwise there would have been no abnormality. Such a large number and such a terrifying degree of accuracy. Was it really possible for humans to achieve this? But when he rummaged through the ashes, he found a burnt piece of paper. When he carefully rummaged through the other ashes, he found the same piece of paper among them. It was burned to ashes in an instant, but those fragile pieces of paper still maintained their curled appearance and were extremely fragmented upon contact. With the amazing vision of a vampire, he distinguished that there were words written on the charred and carbonized pieces of paper, which looked like a name. Every piece of paper had the same name. Androids. Ai Qing decisively concluded. These guys are androids, small miracles created by imitating humans through alchemy. Huai Shi could not help but click his tongue. Of course, he knew about android. In fact, this was a tool often used in alchemy and could be said to have a rather ancient history. This kind of puppet, which was directly made of various metals, elements, and a large amount of water, had no self-consciousness at all. It could almost be said that it was a puppet like a walking corpse. Before making them, the maker would put a piece of paper with a name written on it into a container and use this name to make them work. But the biggest limitation was that these androids could only exist for a day and a night at most. No matter when it was born, once it was exposed to the sunlight of the next day, it would automatically dissipate. This was a flaw that could not be avoided no matter how outstanding an alchemist was. But the entire crew was made up of androids? Moreover, it looked so agile and possessed extraordinary strength. It was simply unbelievable. Stop daydreaming. Ai Qing suddenly woke up. Go to the captain's room now. Huai Shi nodded and followed Ai Qing's instructions. He turned around and sneaked into the cabin, silently running toward the captain's room at the top. Whether or not the captain existed at this time, if there was anything fishy about the ship, there would be some trace of it in the captain's cabin. Even if there was nothing, they could at least find information about the ship and the new world. However, his speed had already slowed down. As he sped all the way to the captain's quarters, he saw other figures rushing towards the captain's quarters. It was not just old Xiao and the others. The rather strange couple from the restaurant last night was also rushing towards the captain's quarters. As they ran forward, the wife, whose face was full of dust, was still scolding her man for wasting time. But when they suddenly pushed open the door of the captain's room, they only saw a chair. It was empty. Other than the chair, there was nothing else here. On the chair, one could see the captain's loose uniform and the remains of his ashes. There was still wine in the tilted wine bottle on the ground, and the carpet was soaked. It seemed that at the last moment before he dissipated, he was still drinking wine and did not expect the destruction that would happen a moment later. Or perhaps he had expected it, but chose to enjoy himself at the last moment. Now the wine bottle had fallen to the ground, soaked in the ashes after he dissipated. In the dust, a wildflower that seemed to have been picked from a tree on the shore could be seen. There was still a faint fragrance left. It was as if it had found the meaning of life in the short time of its death, so when it left, it was as if it had been liberated. It was clearly a puppet with a body, but it was like a real human. Among the people who followed behind, someone cried out softly. When Huaishir looked back, he saw a stunned Hela. She glanced at the ashes on the ground, and her expression changed. It seemed to be pity. Soon, she turned and left. Nothing. Huaishir sighed and turned to leave, but his footsteps suddenly stopped. In the chaos of people and the sound of rummaging around, he heard an extra footstep. Thanks to the vampire's excellent hearing and vision, Huaishir even saw the dust on the ground fly up for no reason. It was as if it was stuck in the gap of a pair of shoes. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the few specks of dust that quietly left in the chaos. He followed the footsteps from afar and followed them. It seemed like he was strolling. He walked to the back of the now empty deck and looked at the faint light of dawn in the distance. He sighed, lowered his head, and took out a bag of tobacco and a stack of white paper. He skillfully rolled one and lit it at the corner of his mouth. Then, he pulled out a knife from behind his waist. The knife whistled and slashed at the footsteps that quietly left behind him. "Come out." In the blink of an eye, the blade broke through the air. A figure suddenly appeared in the void and blocked the knife. It was the figure of Yin Yen. The red hat's stealth ability was indeed terrifying. Even the unique thermal vision of vampires could not find any trace of him. However, Yin Yan's stealth skills were terrible. He did not even notice the two dust particles that followed him. "Don't do it!" He waved his hand in panic. "They're on the same side. They're on the same side. You're on the same side as me." An ear-piercing sound burst out. The knife brushed past his ear and nailed to the deck, startling him. Before he could react, Huaishir held him down and choked him. "Brother, spare me, spare me." He widened his eyes and raised his hands. I surrender, I surrender. How about it? We don't have to fight over that stinking woman Ai Qing, right?" Huaishir was stunned and immediately shuddered. How did he know that he was moving freely and not being controlled by Ai Qing? "I'm familiar with her, brother. Much more familiar than you." Yin Yen saw his stunned expression and knew that he guessed right. He could not help but grin. "I know who that mad dog is going to bite when she opens her mouth. You're too harmless. You're so harmless that even I feel that you're pure. Don't kill me. I'll give you money when we get out. How about that? Don't worry, I won't tell anyone else. Really? Besides, it's not worth risking your life for that cripple. You don't know how many people she's tricked, do you? As long as there's profit, she would even sell her own father." Bang! Huaishir was expressionless. He raised his hand and punched out one of Yin Yan's teeth. "No one will think you're dead if you don't say a few words." Yin Yan obediently shut up. He raised his hands and blinked his eyes. Ai Qing did not seem to be ready to express her opinion. She left everything to Huaishir to decide. "What did you take from the captain's room?" Huaishir asked coldly. "Don't lie. You only have one chance. You have to understand that even if we're teammates, it doesn't have to be you." Yin had definitely rushed into the captain's cabin at the first moment. The fake door that opened with a push was one of the pieces of evidence. If he did not find anything, there was no need for him to hide and sneak out. He could just stand there. "I'm just afraid of trouble," Huaishe heard and coldly pulled out a poison-throwing knife from his sleeve. "If you lie again, I'll ask your cousin how to use it on you." Wait. Yin hurriedly begged for mercy. When he was about to speak, his eyes suddenly lit up. He looked behind Huaishe with a surprised expression. Huaishe sneered and did not look back. "You want to use this kind of trick on me, Lu Peiqi of Huaihai? You think too much. I've been playing this kind of trick since I was 8 years old." But right after that, a sharp and gloomy voice suddenly rang out from behind him, which should have been empty. "Young man, what are you going to do to my dear traveling companion?" Huaishe turned around in shock, only to see an old noblewoman behind her. Her luxurious dress was now stained with blood, and she was holding a dead chicken in her hand. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked like a mad woman. But such an old lunatic appeared behind him inexplicably. Yin took the opportunity to break free from his restraint and then hid beside her. He kept sweet-talking her. "Dear, you came at the right time. Otherwise, the secret I wanted to share with you would have been taken away by this guy." As he spoke, he took out a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to the old woman like a loyal dog. Huaishe's sharp eyes found that the paper in his hand was the captain's relic. Yes, it was the piece of paper that the captain took out and read in the restaurant last night. The crazy woman looked at Huaishe coldly. A murderous intent locked on him, making him break out in a cold sweat. Was he going to die in the hands of this bastard's lover today? "Damn, I knew you were a traitor." But soon, the murderous intent dissipated as she took the piece of paper from Yin's hand. When she lowered her eyes to look at the paper, she was stunned for a moment. Then, unconcealable astonishment and fear appeared on her face. Her hands trembled. Huaishe stood on tiptoe and quietly glanced at the paper. He saw that it was exactly the words that the captain read in public last night, but there was an additional signature. It was a strange signature. It seemed to be a scribbled ancient character, but the writing was not limited to the usual left to right or top to bottom. Instead, it turned on the paper almost at will. The corners were sharp, and in the end, the head and the tail were connected. It turned into a star-like pattern. Wisps of pitch-black ink spread out from its trajectory, radiating in all directions like the light of stars. Huaishe could almost distinguish the scribbled characters. It was the record that Crow forcibly brainwashed him into the Book of Destiny when he taught him the origin of alchemy. It was one of the oldest languages in the West, Hebrew. Heller, Ben, Shahar? He frowned and stammered out the characters on the paper. At that moment, the old woman suddenly looked up. Her originally blue eyes had turned blood-red. He didn't know whether it was because of fear or madness. Her distorted face spasmed and she roared at him. "Don't say that name!" Chapter 127. After seeing the signature, the old woman completely fell into madness. Her mouth muttered something incomprehensible. There was a lot of local language from the Russian Federation, and there were even more swear words and insults. Soon, she clutched the piece of paper tightly. With bloodshot eyes, she ignored Yin and Huaishe and rushed straight into the cabin. In her hand, she had already broken the neck of the chicken that had died long ago. Sticky blood dripped from her feet all the way to the ground. Yin didn't dare to stay in front of Huaishe alone and hurriedly followed. Huaishe also followed from a distance. He wanted to know what she was going to do and why that name made the old woman have such a big reaction. Soon, he saw it. In the dining room, the crazy woman was entangled with his poor brother. He could hear her shrill voice from afar. "You lied to me. You've been lying to me." She seemed to have gone crazy. She shook her old brother who was about to die at any time and screamed angrily, "You know that curse, you know. You know what we're going to face, you liar. Why did you bring me here? The poor old man was originally sitting in a wheelchair, holding a spoon to eat porridge. Now that he was being pulled and shaken by her, he couldn't breathe at all. He coughed violently, and his face turned purple from choking. Even the cereal was spurting out from his nostrils. Huaishe looked from a distance and didn't understand at all. What's with that name? That's the name of the White Crown King, Huaishe. In his mind, Ai Qing's tired sigh came. That's the message written by the White Crown King himself, just like the letter you received. From the moment we boarded the ship, we had already fallen into the White Crown King's plan. Huaishe was stunned for a moment, and immediately felt like falling into an ice cave. What did he do to be schemed against by such a big shot? Don't even talk about scheming against him. That kind of big shot could kill him with just a glance. He wouldn't even be out of breath. Why bother? I remember that you have alchemy tools in your equipment, right? Ai Qing suddenly asked. Can you make atomizers? This was simple. Both Huaishe and Van Helsing knew how to do it. After all, it was a basic consumable used in alchemy. Very good. I need you to go back immediately and work on something according to my instructions. After Huaishe heard this, he couldn't help but be stunned in place. Is there a need for this kind of thing? Confirm a guess. Hurry up, Huaishe, hurry up. Ai Qing whispered hoarsely, we don't have much time left. A quarter of an hour later, Huaishe returned to the restaurant. The process of making an atomizing agent was quite simple. It didn't even need to be ignited. It only needed to simply mix a few powders and liquids together. If one did not pursue the ultimate effect, they would not even pay attention to the proportion. As soon as he entered, he saw old Xiao and the others in the corner looking around nervously. When they saw Huaishe, they waved for him to come over. At this time, the restaurant was almost full. There was a hubbub of voices. After all, after the initial panic, all the passengers instinctively wanted to huddle together for warmth. Even if they couldn't trust each other, they would still gather in places with more people and then blankly exchange their opinions and unreliable messages. Although they had lost all the crew, fortunately, after inspection, they found that the food reserves were quite abundant. It was even enough for them to survive at sea for half a year, but they had to cook their own food. And the ship was still moving. It was as if it had entered unmanned mode. After leaving the control of the crew, it was still sailing toward its destination, but its speed was getting faster and faster. At this moment, they were already in the vast Pacific Ocean with no way out. As they passed through the crowd, Huaishe saw Yin. He was still by the old woman's side, throwing all kinds of sweet words at her as if they didn't cost money. It seemed like he was determined to curry favor with this old golden thigh. But he didn't see the girl called Hila. He didn't know where she went. After sitting down, Huaishe saw the complicated expressions on old Xiao and the others' faces. He did not hide it and simply told them the information. All the crew members are cyborgs. The captain has a manuscript on him for him to read. It's signed by White Crown King. The amount of information was so huge that old Xiao and Lei Feizhou couldn't react in time. Just as they were stunned, a muffled sound suddenly came from the corner of the restaurant, as if a bottle in a bag had broken. Then, a wisp of silver mist gushed out from it, and in an instant, it spread wildly in the wind blowing in from outside the window. It was silver nitrate. It consumed half of Huaishe's stock of silver liquid, which was enough to poison a vampire to death. With the explosion of the atomizer, instantly spread and covered the entire hall, but the amount was so diluted that it was like eating a mouthful of mustard. Huaishe didn't know what Ai Qing wanted to do, but he still chose to do as she said. Now, as the mist spread, violent coughing sounds could be heard. Huaishe subconsciously pulled up his collar to cover his face, not to guard against the poisonous gas, but to prevent his protruding canine teeth from being exposed under the stimulation of the silver poison. But then, he saw under the shroud of the silver mist that could only stimulate dark creatures, pairs of scarlet eyes lit up in the entire restaurant. All that could be seen was that kind of ferocious red light. With the erosion of the silver mist, some of the fragile camouflage cracked open, and a trace of blood-like stench and pure dark aura leaked out. At that moment, Huaisher finally realized. It wasn't just them, it was the monster lurking in the crowd. It was the entire ship, all the passengers were dark creatures. In an instant, those originally numb, old, or dull faces became lively and ferocious, and those old or lethargic eyes also burst out with the cold light of a predator. All the lies were torn apart at this moment, along with the camouflage on them. It was as if they didn't expect such a result. Everyone was stunned on the spot. Only Huaisher heard Ai Qing's sigh. As expected, as early as KP mentioned 1620, she should have thought of it. 1620, just before the establishment of the American genealogy. At that time, the banished Morning Star, the former deputy of the Kingdom of Heaven, and the future White Crown King had already crossed the sea and established his own country on the new continent, a paradise belonging to the otherworldlings. Unfortunately, this paradise was empty, just like hell and heaven. Huaisher heard Ai Qing's hoarse whisper, and on this ship, everyone, I'm afraid, are the members he chose for the American genealogy. There was a moment of dead silence. Then, an even noisier noise swallowed everything. Chaos arrived. Originally, Huaisher thought that this might be some dangerous scheme of Paracelsus. For example, using a ship's worth of people to refine the man-made philosopher's stone. But he didn't expect that this was no longer the criminal plan of a local mafia boss, nor was it something that a tool like Van Helsing or Sure Ahoy could interfere with. Suddenly, it directly rose to an international level, and even more exaggerated than this. This made him completely at a loss for a moment. It can't be like this, right? Even if the club was recruiting, it was just setting up a table in the university square and giving out some free gifts to ask the juniors to give face and come another day. How could they suddenly force people to buy and sell? Just casually boarding a ship and changing their nationality, who could stand this? Moreover, I'm a spy. Isn't this bastard afraid of recruiting a traitor and stabbing him in the back? Huaisher asked in a low voice. Don't guess what people of that level will do, Huaisher, because it's meaningless. Their perspective is already different from us mortals, and even fate and time are just their playthings. Then why did he issue a ticket to a traitor like Van Helsing? This can only mean one thing. Ai Qing said indifferently, when he issued this ticket, he concluded that Van Helsing would become a part of the American genealogy and follow him from the bottom of his heart. At that moment, Huaisher shuddered. Was all of this really under the control of the White Crown King? If it included the grudges between Van Helsing and Paracelsus, then did it include himself who returned to this ship 400 or 500 years later? Were those kings who had transcended time coldly closing the door on this lame farce at the end of time? Just as he was thinking, the noise and chaos in the restaurant had spread. When everyone's hidden faces were exposed, the chaos caused by the initial astonishment and questioning had turned into shoving and fighting. Especially the dark creatures who didn't know how to retreat and understand, the situation was getting more and more intense, until a scream came from the window. Everyone turned back in shock. They saw the light of the morning sun. It was so warm and gentle, reflecting the blue sea and showing the sparkling waves. Coupled with the gentle sea breeze, it was a perfect start to the day. But soon, Huaisher discovered that something was amiss. The light was rapidly dimming. From the initial gentleness, it rapidly weakened to the point of a candle in the wind. But what was even more frightening was that the sun, which had been slowly rising, began to fall at this moment. As if remembering that the tail numbers were restricted today, the sun, which had just gone out, began to reverse into the warehouse, taking away its brilliance from the human world bit by bit until finally, it disappeared under the sea in an instant. Time reversed. The darkness before dawn arrived. But this time there was no light. The night swallowed everything. The huge cruise ship suddenly shook and burst out with a roar. Sailing in the darkness and galloping on the lightless sea, it was as if gradually sinking into the abyss. In the restaurant, silence arrived. The endless darkness didn't give these foreign creatures, who were active in the darkness, the slightest sense of security. On the contrary, a deep fear emerged from everyone's heart. Along with it, there was a sudden realization, perhaps because the Son of Redemption had abandoned them. This world was indifferently staring at their struggling faces. They laughed evilly, waiting for death to come to them. Chapter 128. There was an old joke. It was said that someone on a boat encountered a storm. He suddenly realized that this was God's punishment, so he quickly knelt down and prayed, asking for forgiveness for the sake of other innocent people. At this moment, a sneering question came from the sky. Do you think it's easy for me to gather this boat of people? It's like you think this is some kind of Hollywood special effects film. At most, it's like Michael Bay. Everyone has enough popcorn. After the opening credits, they saw the director's name, Kitano Takashi. The entire boat was filled with villains. Suddenly, everyone seemed to want to die a horrible death. What the F***ck is this? Ai Ching gritted her teeth and suppressed her displeasure. She had already expected what would happen. In history, the White Crown King had sent countless black boats to various parts of the world, but very few could return to the New World. Although most of the elites of the American lineage rode such boats all the way, there must have been more than 10 times, or even 100 times, sunk into the ocean before that. Whether or not they would even stay in the present realm was still a question. According to the statistics of the Historical Redaction Committee, the wreckage of this black ship had been excavated in various borders and hell. In other words, its route wasn't as simple as going from one continent to another. The moment they left the port, they were probably no longer in the present realm. Otherwise, there would not be such a strange phenomenon like the sun fading and the eternal night shrouding. No one could resist the self-correction of the present realm to maintain such a huge change. Unless it was in hell. Only such a scene could be realized. The curse of the gods. This strange phenomenon was called so. This world did not allow the rise of the White Crown King. In other words, the gods who still existed in this world in the past and even controlled this world did not allow this traitor to stand on his own. Even if they were temporarily helpless against the White Crown King, who was far away in the New World, they would never let go of any opportunity to eradicate his wings. But most of the people on this boat did not think of seeking refuge with the White Crown King, right? Huaisher sighed. A few clubs are fighting for people. How can they make things difficult for newbies? Ai Ching sneered and asked back. When you moved a chess piece forward on the chessboard, was it your own will, or did you get the permission of the chess piece? Huaisher was silent. He understood what Ai Ching meant. What the chess piece was thinking was not important. The most important thing was where exactly it was located. If they were insignificant, it would not matter if they were abandoned, but if they were located in a dangerous place, then they would be ruthlessly strangled. The so-called human intelligence and human knowledge are too weak, Huaisher. Ai Ching said coldly, in the domain of the fifth step and above, with just a thought, one can easily twist it, just like a marionette. Not only do they have no control over their bodies, even their souls are the currency of the god. The only difference is whose head is printed on it and how much value is hidden behind it. Moreover, even if the gods still had mercy to squander, would there be an innocent person on this boat? Come on, everyone is a dark creature, what is the point of pretending? Including Huaisher's current level of disguise, who is not full of blood debts. The son of original sin? Ai Ching finally remembered the story title that KP had shown at the beginning, and only now did she understand the deep malice hidden in it. What made her even angrier was that since KP's version update, the silhouettes of all the players were covered by a layer of darkness. It was impossible to see the reactions and expressions of others. Apart from a few words with no fluctuations or intonation in the communication between each other, it simply weakened the possibility of cooperation between the players to the greatest extent. The story is the real deal, right? KP seemed to have glimpsed the anger in her heart and said with a smile, "The communication between the characters is the most beautiful part of the story, not the players who are above it. If the characters are wantonly controlled and played by the higher dimensions, then what is the difference between what the gods did to humans in the past?" Ai Ching didn't say anything more. But Huai Shi was under a lot of pressure. After learning about the bloody history of this dungeon from Ai Ching, he no longer had much confidence in clearing this dungeon. Even if he, a demon hunter, killed all the dark creatures on the boat one by one, he wouldn't be able to kill them all in 10 days. Moreover, in this dark ocean, even the huge steel cruise ship couldn't bring him much sense of security. No matter how strong the ship was, how many dark creatures could tear it down? It could be said that as long as chaos broke out, everything would be destroyed. And Pericus could hide in the dark. As long as he didn't show up, Huai Shi would lose. Moreover, was Van Helsing's mission really so simple? Huai Shi didn't think all this would be so simple when it involved the struggle between the Holy Spirit lineage and the American lineage. If it was just a mission, how could there be a record in the Philosopher's Stone? Whose Philosopher's Stone is this? He was now puzzled from the bottom of his heart. It can't be the White Crown King's, right? Don't be kidding. The White Crown King has long been above the Fifth Order. The stigmata of fallen morning star is just a power imitated by later generations based on his miracle. Ai Ching said, "It's most likely some lucky person on the boat who has successfully reached the New World." No, this means that this boat has a considerable chance of reaching the New World safely. Huai Shi, we still have a chance. Huai Shi knew, but he was worried that this chance would soon be gone. Because the people on the boat were about to fight. Huai Shi, an indifferent player, might not be able to understand their situation at that time, nor could he feel the horror and despair of being abandoned by the whole world in an instant. But there was no doubt that for the dark creatures, chaos and fighting had long been an instinct engraved in their bones. After the initial fear, this strange, everlasting night brought about a bone-deep pressure and an indelible despair. Then, they were on the verge of madness. Huai Shi could almost see the fuse that was as fragile as a candle in the wind gradually collapsing. "Don't get involved. Let's protect ourselves first," Old Xiao said in a low voice. "Come to my room later. The situation has changed. We need to take the long view." No one objected to this. At this critical juncture where chaos was about to break out, not to mention turning the tide, even self-preservation might become quite difficult. Even if the Third Order stigmata was already considered an expert among this group of dark creatures, who knew how many strong dragons were hidden among them. Huai Shi alone could feel a strong sense of oppression from several people, and he could not rule out the possibility that there were people at the fourth stage hiding among them. But unexpectedly, the one who stood out to turn the tide at this time was unexpectedly the woman in the restaurant who looked unusually worn out last night. She and her inflexible husband had left an unusually deep impression on Huai Shi. It was not just the huge difference between the husband and wife, but also their actions this morning. When they sensed that the crew had died, they immediately rushed in the direction of the captain's room. At least, it could be seen that their minds were still clear, and they knew that infighting at this time was tantamount to suicide. The woman who called herself Lady Eleanor tried her best to appease the people around her, and it seemed to be quite effective. Until the old woman with the chicken's neck in her hand went crazy again. "Shut up, bitch, this is not a place for you to sell your sex life," she screamed angrily. "You don't know anything at all. Just for an illusory hope, you overestimated yourselves and stepped on this ship to seek your own death. Now that death is here, are you still afraid? What are you counting on? Counting on this group of losers to unite? counting on this group of trash who have been chased by the Holy Spirit lineage for decades without daring to show their faces? Trash is trash no matter where they go. Do you think the White Crown King will protect you if the gods are cruel to you? Some people glared angrily, but the old woman's expression became more and more ferocious. Am I wrong? Who can you count on? This prostitute bitch? The one over there who only knows how to hug the cat and act pretentious? Or this rotten old man in a wheelchair who can't even speak clearly? Forget it, you can't count on anyone. Okay, shut up, Yaga. In the wheelchair, her brother finally spoke, hoarse and muddy. Don't say any more. What did I say? Yaga sneered. The truth? I said shut up. Her brother raised his muddy eyes and stared at her, some kind of terrifying light shooting out from his eyes. Don't you know that I am saving you? Ha ha, my good brother, you only want to save yourself. Yaga roared. You only want the White Crown King to extend your life. You did not hesitate to trick me onto this ship. I said shut up. Her brother spoke again, as if the authority of an elder brother had finally taken effect. Yaga's old face twitched, and she did not say anything more. She just screamed and turned to leave the restaurant. The chicken in her hand was still dripping blood, and her hysterical cursing and roaring could be vaguely heard from the corridor. I am sorry for what my sister said. In the silence, the old man in the wheelchair first looked at the young man in the corner. She did not mean it, but after my two nieces passed away, her actions were a little extreme. I know. The Egyptian young man holding the cat laughed arrogantly, with a hint of mockery. She is just a crazy girl, I will not care about anything because of her. The old man nodded. Is our alliance still in effect, Pharaoh? Of course, kosher. The Pharaoh holding the cat glanced at the people around him indifferently, as if he was looking at dust. His eyes were contemptuous. Before we reach the New World, the Sphinx and I will not do anything to you. Thank you for your generosity. The old man slowly turned his wheelchair and looked around. Did you hear that? Calm down, all of you. Other than this feudal night, there is nothing we can do to the gods. The White Crown King will grant us protection, all you need to do is wait. He said, dawn will eventually come. It was like a lame joke, but no one could laugh. Huai Shi sat on the chair in a daze, like an obedient child, with a pure expression and harmless eyes. Then his heart was beating wildly, and he did not have any strength to laugh. Yaga, Kosher, the Pharaoh, the Sphinx, oh my God, what kind of fight was this? Chapter 129. Baba Yaga, or Granny Yaga. If there was anyone who could speak for the word witch, it would be her. Since the birth of the witch, there were many horrible legends that had been spread among the Slav. The witch who lived in a chicken's foot house, the refiner of the black magic potion, the eternal nightmare in the eternal frost wilderness and the forest. Kashchi, the immortal, the wizard, the shapeshifter, and even the representative of evil that could be written into the source of Slavic mythology. He also inherited the blood of God and had become famous hundreds of years ago. He could be said to be the role model of the Devil King. Until now, there was still a place called Koshchikovo in the Russian Federation. What was more terrible than his notoriety was his strong vitality. It was said that he hid his soul in a needle, and then hid the needle in a duck egg, and then hid the duck egg in a hare's stomach, and so on. Finally, he sealed everything on an oak tree in the endless sea. This way, people who couldn't find his soul couldn't really kill him. Perhaps the rumors were exaggerated. After all, he had become famous 700 years ago. 700 years. More than 20 generations had passed. Countless dynasties had risen and fallen, and the world had changed. Now, countless people at the same time had already declined, but he was still alive and well. He could even eat oatmeal, take a boat, and go out for a walk when he had nothing to do. As for the Pharaoh and the Sphinx, there was no need to say more. If it was true, Then one was a descendant of the true god who inherited the blood of nobility, and the other was a fierce monster. It was just unknown which pharaoh it was, whether his title had been taken away, and how much of his power was left, and how many generations of the Sphinx were there. But no matter how weak the pharaoh was, Huai sure couldn't afford to provoke him. It was one thing for a quagmire to suddenly turn into a poisonous pond, but now 4 crocodiles had appeared. Huai sure, a newbie, was at a loss for what to do. The others were also in a state of shock, dumbfounded. Only after the big shots had left did everyone heave a sigh of relief. How could there be so many big shots on such a small ship? Everyone suddenly felt a great deal of pressure. Huai sure, on the other hand, was under even more pressure. He knew that there was a hidden boss, Paracelsus, who could wield the Philosopher's Stone with his bare hands. He still had to think of a way to kill him. Oh my God, is this game really meant for humans? If he was lucky, Parathussel might not have a Philosopher's Stone on him, but if he was unlucky, everyone would become a Philosopher's Stone in his plan. Even an idiot would know that if such an advanced gadget could be manufactured, the materials needed to make it must be very expensive. The Philosopher's Stone itself was the embodiment of miracles in the mortal world. What could be more suitable than the sacred mark formed by countless miracles? It seems that the order on the ship can be maintained for the time being. Old Shao wiped the sweat off his forehead and looked at Lei Feizhou and Huai sure. Our top priority is to explore the entire ship. Lei Feizhou asked, "Where's Yin? Hasn't Yin already gotten on Papaya's good side? Let him go and gain some affection," Old Shao suggested. "If possible, everyone should try to hang out with Kush and the pharaoh to see if we can find any clues." "Forget it," Huai sure's face turned green. Kush might look silly in his wheelchair, but it was hard to say whether he had Alzheimer's. As for the one holding the cat, he didn't look like someone easy to talk to. The way he looked at people as if they didn't exist meant that he didn't put these people in his eyes at all. If they rashly tried to strike up a conversation with him, it would be fine if they got snubbed, but if they made him unhappy and released the cat, who would be able to stand it? Whoever wanted to go could go, but he wasn't going. Huai sure completely forgot that he had the highest charm value and charm skill in the whole team. Today, he was just slacking off, seeing that Huai sure wasn't willing to charm him or die. Lei Feizhou seemed to snort coldly and wasn't too happy. "But you can actually try to seduce that old woman," Ai Qing suggested sincerely. "I think it'll be a piece of cake. You can forget about it." Huai sure recalled the layers of wrinkles on Papaya's face, and couldn't help but shudder. In the end, everyone's discussion was inconclusive. They could only temporarily decide to split up and explore, and then meet up with Old Shao in his room at dinnertime to see if they could find any clues. In the current chaos, there was really no place to start. But when Huai sure walked in the corridor, he noticed that the remains of the crew on the ground seemed to have been touched. Other than the uniform that was still there, the ashes had all disappeared. They had been taken away. Doesn't this prove that Paracas Seal has taken action? Huai sure suddenly had a headache. He miscalculated. Although a certain amount of source substance was consumed during the creation of androids, the materials could actually be recycled and reused. In other words, after a batch of androids died, the ashes could be collected and poured into a petri dish, boiled and soaked, and a new batch could quickly grow out. It was more convenient than leaks. Moreover, now that the night had suddenly come and shrouded the entire sea area, it was hard to say when it would light up again. In other words, the android's endurance was greatly increased. "I feel that the situation is not good." Huai sure sighed and suddenly stopped in his tracks. He smelled blood. It was in the direction of the entrance to the warehouse. Vampires were innately sensitive to the smell of blood, even more sensitive than a dog's nose, especially this kind of precious blood with a foreign smell. It was under the stairs. "So, that guy Yu Jun violated 2 of the 3 prohibitions on the ship last night at once?" No, maybe he violated all 3 prohibitions. The 3 prohibitions only apply between last night and 6 o'clock today, which is the moment when the sun sets and the night comes again. Ai Ching said, there should be no danger down there now. If you don't feel at ease, I can help you sneak in. Huai Shi stood in the shadows and instantly felt as if his body had become transparent. It was as if he had become a ghost again. It seemed that Ai Ching's sneak had taken effect. After checking his equipment again, he carefully stepped into the darkness of the warehouse. Unexpectedly, there wasn't a hideous demon's lair below. There was not even the sound of water flowing that was usually heard at the bottom of the cruise ship. In the silence, only the low roar of the engine room could be heard. At the entrance, Huai Shi also saw a few lines of dirty footprints, as if someone had already gone in, and there were also traces of someone coming out. There was no blood, and probably not many parts were missing. Huai Shi felt a lot more at ease. When he passed by the engine room, the boiler room, and the electronic control room, Huai Shi was still worried and went in to take a look, but it seemed that the disappearance of the crew did not affect or hinder the operation of the cruise ship. Everything was normal. It was as if it was being maintained by pairs of invisible hands. Walking in it felt as if he was walking through countless invisible souls, and he felt a chill. After Huai Shi closed the door, he breathed a sigh of relief. Regardless of the principle, as long as the ship could move, it was fine. He was simply immune to this kind of haunted and supernatural phenomenon. What a joke! He grew up in the Stone Marrow Hall and had seen all kinds of things. This was nothing to him. It didn't take long for him to follow the smell of blood and find a corpse. Or rather, Yu Jun's corpse. There was nothing to hide or cover at all. It was lying on the ground at the end of the corridor like a beach sunbathing. Dark blood flowed all over the ground and the stench was overwhelming. He had only died for one night, but it seemed like he had been abandoned for many days. The rotten bones were almost exposed. The swollen corpse was full of maggots. There was no doubt that he had been killed. The headless horseman that represented death had fallen into death, and the headless horseman had also lost his head when he died. The white bones of the headless corpse were exposed in the stench, and there were still traces of it being rummaged through. Huai Shi pinched his nose and leaned over. He squatted down, endured the nausea and dizziness from the bottom of his heart, and took a careful look. Then, of course, he couldn't see anything. He wasn't a forensic doctor himself, and he hadn't learned any autopsy skills. It was even more impossible for Van Helsing to know how to collect evidence from corpses. If he could see it, then Yu Jun was really dead. It was almost rotten. Can you see anything? Huai Shi asked. Wait a moment. Take a look at the situation around you. Ai Qin commanded. Then, there was a faint sound of dice rolling. The dim warehouse seemed to instantly light up, and all the scenes were vivid in their eyes, including the mosquitoes that flew up. He was killed by someone. After a short moment of thought, Ai Qing simply made a meaningless judgment. Then, she added, he was killed twice by different people. You'll know when you look behind you. Ai Qing guided Huai Shi to look at the place in the middle of the corridor where the blood had just appeared, all the way to where Yu Jun's corpse was now. The headless horseman's stigmata doesn't mean that the sublimator has no head. It's just that after modification and correction, the life system of the sublimator has been modified in advance, transferring the function of thinking to the soul and preserving it in the body. This reduces the importance of the brain and head, and even if they are lost, they won't die. In other words, even if their head is cut off, they can still live for a long time. At worst, they can just put another one on. Ai Qing said. When he walked to the middle of the corridor, he was attacked. Someone hid in the corner and cut off his head. It was clean and neat. Then Yu Jun was scared and wanted to run forward, but he didn't expect that there was another person in front of him. This time, he was killed cleanly and completely. 2 people, twice. There wasn't even a trace of struggle. Huai Shi felt a little headache, But immediately, AI Ching once again provided an even worse conjecture. Or, after he was attacked, he ran forward because there was someone he knew in front of him. Then, he died in the hands of his allies. Huai Shi sucked in a breath of cold air. There's a mole, terminate the transaction. At this moment, Huai Shi heard the sound of dice rolling continuously. Chapter 130. At this moment, Huai Shi heard the sound of the dice continuously ringing. Not only Huai Shi, AI Ching even saw with her own eyes that the dice in KP's hand, that seemed to be able to control the world, jumped out of his palm and began to madly roll and jump on the table. Once, twice, thrice, 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 fine and noisy sounds were incessant. But this time, she didn't see the usual nasty smile on KP's face. Instead, there was a trace of doubt and astonishment. It was as if the story was out of control. Every time the dice jumped, it represented the judgment of a certain event. In other words, in a split second, who knows how many things were rearranged and modified. It was as if a drum was beating on the heart, making people dizzy, and couldn't help but sweat profusely. No, in fact, Huai Shi really began to feel dizzy and was sweating profusely. He staggered back 2 steps, violently vomiting, feeling the pain in his lungs become more and more intense, as if his soul was being burned by fire. In an instant, he almost didn't even have the strength to stand. Only cold sweat continuously fell from his cheeks to the ground. In the midst of the violent gasping, his vision turned black. He felt a burst of dizziness, almost fainting and falling to the ground. Even AI Ching's voice became distant and indistinct. Was he poisoned? He immediately reacted, leaving the corpse on the ground, turned around and walked towards the exit of the warehouse, wanting to go back to the room to find the antidote. But he was even more afraid. What kind of poison was hidden in Yujun's corpse that made him, a third-rank vampire, lose all his fighting strength in an instant? In the midst of staggering and swaying, he gathered all his strength, little by little climbed up the ladder, and walked out of the warehouse entrance. Before he had time to open his mouth, he felt a sudden shock at the back of his head. It was as if he had been hit with a stick. But he didn't feel any pain, instead he couldn't feel anything, falling straight to the ground, his face hitting the floor, faintly hearing excited shouts behind him. "I caught him," a voice excitedly said. "This kid must have found something good in the warehouse." "Not here. Bring it back first. Bring it back. No, bring it to a place where there's no one. See if there's anything valuable on it. After you're done, throw it into the sea." Another voice urged him on. Huai Shi felt himself being pulled by someone. One of his legs was pulled forward, and Huai Shi felt his face rubbing against the deck. To be honest, it was cool and refreshing. However, he still felt terrible. He couldn't even move a finger. Until a vaguely familiar voice sounded. "What are you doing?" "That's right." Opposite KP, Crow nodded in satisfaction. "It's about time for the plot to speed up. If we keep wasting words on the atmosphere, the audience will say that we're filling it up." KP's face twitched. "When did you? When I saw my son on TV on the dark web." Crow pointed at his phone and said, "I'm your loyal fan. Have you received any tips from me? You get 10 yuan every day." The audience should sit properly in the auditorium. KP's expression became gloomy. "You're interfering with the story." "Ha, I'm just making some slight corrections to your boring story." Crow whistled. "Even if it's documentary literature, there's no need to be so stubborn about every detail, right? Or have you become one of those rigid bengestics? You'll only make things more difficult for him." "Isn't that what you want?" Crow asked back. "As one of the managers of heaven and one of the 3 human natures created by the Utopia, didn't you come here because of your doubts about Huai Shi? Why do you have to be so secretive and pretend to be fair? Every player is fair. But the difficulties we face are different, right?" Crow tilted her head and looked at him. We're so familiar with each other. Don't play word games. To be honest, I don't object if you want to increase the difficulty. KP's expression became suspicious. He did not know what she was up to. If he didn't have this aptitude, I wouldn't have chosen him to be my contractor, so you can bring it on. No matter what you've prepared, he won't lose. Crow made a firm decision and told him word by word, no matter what you've prepared, he will not lose. Is that so? KP looked at her quietly. After a long time, he suddenly smiled happily. Then, I'm looking forward to it. He threw the dice in his hand. With a tearing sound, the sound of paper tearing was heard again. A basin of cold water was splashed on Huaishi's face. Huaishi opened her eyes from the dizziness and felt that she was finally awake. She panted heavily and struggled to get up from the ground, but she couldn't. There were several times when she ended up lying on the ground in a sorry state, fainting from thirst for blood. An indifferent voice asked, "How long has it been since you last drank blood?" Huaishi was stunned for a moment. Thinking carefully, it seemed that ever since he got on the ship, he had not drunk that kind of thing. Quite long? A vegetarian vampire. The girl named Hila seemed to be amused. She looked at him struggling to get up from the ground, but she did not have any intention of helping him. Until Huaishi turned over with difficulty and saw the silver-haired girl standing by his feet, he was a little uncertain. I remember I was hit by a stick? Hila looked at the book in her hand coldly. If you're talking about the two guys who were about to throw you into the sea, yes. Anyway, thank you. I just hate being disturbed. In this remote room, the girl raised her amber eyes and looked at him. If you can walk, please leave this place as soon as possible. Okay. Huaishi smiled bitterly and struggled to get up from the ground. After the initial pain, which was similar to a drug addiction, had passed, the remaining dizziness was slightly better. However, this was only the final radiance of the setting sun. If he did not replenish his blood plasma in time, it would not be long before his condition became more and more serious. The reason vampires were called vampires was because this excessively fierce dark stigmata needed to regularly absorb life force to maintain its operation. If he ignored it, the backlash would be more and more serious. In the end, his stigmata would start to digest itself, first sucking him dry and then melting away. Only a dried corpse would be left. He had to return to his room as soon as possible. No matter what happened, he had to take care of it first. Thinking of the few red tubes waiting for him in the room, his heart became more and more thirsty. However, he held the door and did not leave. After hesitating for a moment, he turned back and said, "About last night, I'm sorry." Hila raised her eyes and glanced at him. "Are you talking about the attack on my secondary sexual characteristics?" Yes. Hila nodded and asked, "Then, what are you trying to do by saying all this now?" "Probably to apologize." Huaishi smiled bitterly. "Anyway, I'm sorry. I hope you can forgive me." "Forgive?" Hila frowned as if she was thinking about something. She lowered her head and suddenly looked at the thick book in her hand. "Forgive, page 741, forgive." The pages of the book were as thin as a cicada's wings and were filled with dense handwriting, just like an encyclopedia. Very soon, he flipped to the middle section and saw the word "forgive" and the related explanation. It seemed to be written with two different colored pens, one black and one red. Huaishi tiptoed slightly to take a look, only to find that it was 2 rows of densely packed lists. Very soon, the girl buried in the book looked up at him and said coldly, "I forgive you." It was as if she had just stepped on him. It was normal. Huaishi was stunned. This kind of thing could be decided just by flipping through a book? But then, the girl suddenly frowned. "No, the harassment of secondary sexual characteristics is unforgivable." I see. As the pages turned on their own, the girl's eyes jumped between the countless words and finally led to a branch suggestion. In an instant, hostility appeared in the girl's eyes. Huaishi's vision blurred. A slender knife fell from her sleeve and was held tightly by 5 fingers. In an instant, it was pressed against Huaishi's neck, accurately pressing against the artery. Her cold eyes were filled with wariness. Hila asked coldly, "What do you want to do to me? I accidentally touched it last night, and you only reacted now. Isn't this reaction a little too long?" "Wait, don't do it." Huaishi was stunned. "I just want to." He stuttered for a long time before sighing helplessly. "I want to be friends with you, okay? Friends." Hila frowned. The dictionary in her right hand flipped again and finally stopped at the front part. This time, the distance was close enough, and Huaishi quietly saw the definition of the friends column. A sucker who will die for you at a critical moment. Someone who needs to be careful and vigilant. Highly dangerous. Make sure to be used with caution when necessary. Damn, that's so hardcore. What dictionary is this? Make one for me too. Huaishi was about to break out in cold sweat. He could only try to open his eyes wide, as if he was sincere in his awkwardness. "No." Hila coldly refused, and then put away the knife in her hand. "Now, please leave." Okay, I don't even have the value of being a scapegoat at a critical moment?" Feeling a sense of defeat from being looked down upon, Huaishi retreated resentfully and closed the door for her. She held onto the wall as she walked out in a sorry state. It was not until she returned to her room that she sat on the chair and let out a sigh of relief. He felt cold sweat seeping out of his back like a tap that had been turned on. He drank the blood in the test tube in one gulp. Feeling the sweet refreshment from Van Helsing and the physiological disgust from Huaishi couldn't tell whether he felt good or wanted to vomit. He just felt that the part that belonged to Van Helsing was gradually growing in his consciousness. Gradually, it was assimilated by the ice-like obsession, along with the nauseating stench of the blood and the hunger that spread in his lungs. It was getting harder and harder to distinguish between you and me. After a long rest, he finally caught his breath and knocked on old Zhao's door. No one responded behind the door. It opened with a push. The stench overflowed from it. In the silence, Huaishi covered his face in despair. F***CK Chapter 131. Old Zhao was dead. It was impossible to tell how long he had been dead. It seemed that once you died on this ship, you would immediately start to rot. The stench was frightening. The moment the door opened, what entered their eyes was countless spurts of blood. On the bed, the floor, the walls, and the ceiling, the slurry that had already lost its fresh color was everywhere. It was dim and yellow, dripping sticky, until it finally dried up into ugly traces. And old Zhao was in the middle of this scene, sitting on the chair he had prepared for his teammates. It was torn apart, as if it had been cut into 17 or 18 pieces by a sharp knife. Even his head had been smashed and drooped down from his neck, like a basketball hanging in a net. Huaishi resisted the urge to vomit, summoned his courage, and walked through the door. He didn't see any damage caused by a struggle, nor were there any traces of struggle. He had died quietly. It was so silent that it was abnormal. Huaishi stared blankly at all this, his brain suddenly unable to wrap itself around it. What the hell? He couldn't help but rub his face. Why are people dying in this game like ordering takeout? Is there a delivery? He sat on the floor tiredly and watched all this. It took him a long time before he finally reacted. Old Zhao was indeed dead. Although the death of a teammate seemed to be a common thing in this game, and there was no need to be surprised or scared, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of depression. The only teammate who seemed a little more reliable had inexplicably died just like that. Did it have to be like this? It was foreseeable that this team of players, which had been riddled with holes, was about to break up. What was even more painful than the loss of morale was that there was no one to lead the team. In less than 2 days since the start of the game, Their teammates were dying at a rate of one dying per day. First, it was Yu Jun, then old Xiao. Who would be next? Even worse, including Clement, who had become an NPC, half of the 6 people had died, but they hadn't found anything yet. Not to mention clues, the entire ship was like a boiling cauldron. It was difficult to even protect themselves, let alone reach the new world and complete their mission. The newbie didn't even have the strength to tremble. Just as he was looking around, a sudden burst of information entered his mind. It seemed that the AI Qing had made an investigation. Through the messy scene, he miraculously found a lot of traces from the dismembered corpse. First, I sneaked in. Then, I slashed at his throat, legs, arms, heart. He could almost imagine a black figure suddenly appearing in front of old Xiao, slashing his throat and stopping him from roaring. Then, the figure accurately cut the tendons in his legs, cutting off any possibility of him escaping. Old Xiao reached out to grab him, but his arms, which were as thick as trees, were chopped off one after another. His arms flew up and fell to the ground, blood spurting out. No, this time the weapon had been changed. It was something heavier and sharper. The murderer stepped forward and stepped on old Xiao. The weapon in his hand slashed down with irresistible force, cutting open old Xiao's chest and tearing out his heart. Finally, he abruptly turned the weapon around and smashed the heavy steel onto old Xiao's skull. Pop! The sound of bubbles popping could be heard. It was as if the murderer had killed a chicken. It was over. But just as Huai Shi was guessing, when the black figure turned around, he saw a face that he couldn't believe. It was himself. Yes, that's right. First, he used a dagger to take the initiative, then used a large axe to break through the diffusion defense. Finally, he used the blunt back of the axe to smash the corpse. The whole process was smooth and fluid. The small hammer scratched the seams, and the large hammer finished the job. No matter how he looked at it, it was familiar. He saw old Zhao's face. At the last moment, the broken face was distorted, and it looked like a smile. He stared at Huai Shi mockingly, which made him feel uncomfortable. He only felt a chill in his heart. Don't talk about space-time travel or something like that, AI Qing said. It's not the first time KP deliberately mystifies things. Maybe the murderer wants you to think that way. There are only a few ways to kill people, and it's very common to see similarities. She didn't say the last sentence. Instead of worrying about this, it was better to worry that he would lose control and kill old Xiao while he was unconscious due to thirst for blood. But what was the point of that? Even if Huai Shi wanted to find the blood bag, he would only look for the woman closest to him called Hila, right? Regardless of motive, time, or reason, Huai Shi couldn't have committed the crime. Then who could have done it? Enemy? Teammate? Lei Feizhou? Or Yin Yan? Just as she was deep in thought, Huai Shi turned around and saw a burly man standing at the door without her noticing. Lei Feizhou looked at him expressionlessly, looking at his panicked expression and frowning. Huai Shi was stunned at first, then he raised his hands. I'm not. I didn't say you were. He was dead when I came an hour ago, Lei Feizhou said expressionlessly. I was the one who broke the door open. At that time, he was still warm. Huai Shi was speechless. I looked all over the ship, but I couldn't find you. Yin Yan was still licking Papaya's leg. He didn't even have a chance to talk. At this point, he seemed to be disheartened. He raised the black plastic bag in his hand and said, Let's clean up old Xiao first. If there's anything, we can talk about it at the restaurant tonight. Looking at the bag in Lei Feizhou's hand, Huai Shi felt guilty. Yu Jun's body was still in the warehouse, and no one cared about it. The two of them cleaned up in silence. Estimating that it was time for dinner, they got up and went to the restaurant. Compared to the low atmosphere last night, today's restaurant was really gloomy. Most of the people were sitting in their seats, drinking mouthfuls of that strange soup that they didn't know how it was made. To be honest, just smelling it made them want to throw up. However, the ship's chef also disappeared with the crew. Now, the chef was a little green goblin who was said to have come from a remote place. It was the kind of little thing that would cook for people and play pranks in some fairy tales. Although it wasn't liked, it could be said that it was naturally warm-hearted. However, it didn't seem to be very good at cooking. Moreover, no one had the appetite to eat. Old Xiao wasn't the only one who died today. 4 people died as well. 1 died in a fight, 2 died mysteriously, and 1 had already broken down and wanted to jump into the sea and swim back to Rome. His stigmata was probably some kind of aquatic species. Then everyone saw that the person who fell into the sea dissolved little by little, as if he had fallen into the stomach of a behemoth. Amid the screams, Huaishe even saw the Rain Man curled up in a corner. A small dark cloud floated above his head. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. It looked really miserable. Someone was smoking next to him, and another person kept asking his companion nervously, "Did you see where my magical insoles are?" Magical insoles my ass. However, when he passed by the middle, he saw hell again. Unexpectedly, someone was sitting next to her. It was the woman who had tried to pacify them last night. What was her name again? He didn't remember. Although his face was full of dust, he had been trying very hard to show off and show off. Unfortunately, she was always treated as a background and didn't have much of a presence. Now, she was saying something intimately to Hell with a gentle smile, trying to get closer. However, Hell's expression was still indifferent, as if she didn't hear what she was saying at all. She just frowned and looked at the soup in front of her. The atmosphere in the restaurant was really not good. The 2 of them didn't have much of an appetite. In addition, the soup tasted so weird that they couldn't eat it. They could only stare at the bowl in a daze. After a long time, Yin Yen finally arrived. He was in high spirit. Following behind Papaya, he carried a bag and waited for the old lady to sit down. Then, he swaggered over and sat down. He looked at the 2 of them and asked, "What's the matter?" Huaishe took a deep breath. He didn't want to argue with this pretentious guy. He just said, "Old Xiao is dead. I heard." Yin Yen crossed his arms. "If he's dead, then he's dead." Lei Feizhou frowned unhappily. "What do you mean?" "Literally," Yin Yen said coldly. "Isn't the hint from KP obvious enough? It's for us to suck up to someone powerful. It's obviously impossible to get to America on our own. If I were you, I'd waste my time. I'd hurry up and get on the good side of that retarded old man and the kitten-hugging kid. Let me warn you, don't fight with me. Brother, you're quite broad-minded. You're proud of being a cowherd." Huaishe sneered and asked directly, 5 big things: ball, fire, nail, pliers, hammer. How many can you take out? You don't have any skills and you dare to be a cowherd? Yin Yen was stunned. He didn't know if it was because he was shocked by the 5 big things or because he felt Huaishe's master-level pressure. He was so embarrassed that he couldn't speak. Soon, he stubbornly said, "This has nothing to do with you. I advise you not to wander around outside. Be careful or you'll die early." "Don't be an alarmist," Lei Feizhou said coldly. "You still don't understand?" Yin Yen was amused. He glanced at Huaishe and Lei Feizhou's expressions, and his expression became ferocious. "First Yu Jun, then old Xiao. They died so quickly. I don't believe that there's no one behind this," he said. "There's a traitor among us." Dead silence. The few of them looked at each other in silence. It was like before the child spoke. The king's naked streak was a secret in everyone's hearts. Once the child spoke, everyone had to think of a way to deal with the consequences of the king's naked streak. "See, even you have nothing to say?" Yin Yen sneered. "I'm not interested in who did it, but if you want to have any ideas about me, forget it. If you want to fight among yourselves, you 2 can go play by yourselves." Huaishe frowned and didn't speak. Although he didn't have any expectations for his teammates from the beginning, it was very infuriating to break up like this. But what could he do? Once the seed of doubt was planted, it wouldn't be easy to pull it out. Moreover, from the beginning, this team could be said to be riddled with holes. Soon, he heard the sharp sound of a plate breaking on the table next to him. There was also a hoarse scream. "There's poison in the soup." Chapter 132. The entire cafeteria was disturbed by the scream. Immediately, all the ferocious gazes turned to the Green Goblin at the back of the cafeteria, who was stirring a large ladle. The midget-like man shuddered and screamed. "I'm not. I didn't," he explained in horror. "I swear. I only threw an insole in." Well, Huai sure now knew where the magical insoles of the table of people went. So, the smell of feet in the soup was really the smell of feet. No matter what, let's tie this bastard up and beat him up first. But soon, someone discovered that the person who fell to the ground was really poisoned. The toxin was very mild, like a snake venom, but the dosage was not high. Dark creatures had a high resistance to poison. As long as they did not encounter a specific poison, drinking diluted soup would, at most, make their mouths numb. But there was no doubt about the existence of the toxin. Immediately, the Green Goblin was hung up. Then, a group of people scooped up half a dead pig, 2 boots, and a green stinky insole. It seemed to be the magical insole. Now it seemed that the insole was indeed very magical. After it was thrown into the soup, it absorbed a lot of poison. Otherwise, most people here would have suffered. But this did not prevent the Green Goblin who lost the insole and the guy who lost the insole from being hung up by the angry passengers and beaten to the point that they could not breathe out. Then, after an inspection, more than one person came to a conclusion. The food was really poisonous. What was worse was that not only the food in the cafeteria, but even the food and meat in the cold storage and the water on the ship were poisoned. In order to avoid being discovered, the dosage was quite small, but it still could not stop the accumulation of the poison over a long period of time. If it wasn't for the stinky insole, it would have been too late by the time they realized it. Although Huai Sure had taken a simple sample, without the alchemy equipment in his room, it was difficult to determine what kind of poison it was. Just as he was about to go back to his room to do an analysis and see if he could make an inferior antidote based on the routine in Van Helsing's memory, he suddenly heard a hysterical scream from the crowd. "It's her!" A stooped man with a face full of ulcers jumped up and pointed at a figure in the crowd. "It must be that woman who poisoned him. During the day, my friend and I were almost poisoned to death by her." This voice was so familiar, as if he had heard it somewhere before. Damn it! This was the bastard who had knocked him out. When Huai Sure finally reacted, he suddenly had a bad premonition. Following his finger, he saw a stunned Hila. "It wasn't me." Hila frowned and looked over coldly. The person with the ulcers shrank back, and his expression became even more vicious. "If it's not you, who else could it be? Could it be that the sores on my face grew by themselves?" Someone's expression became obscene. "Now that everyone is here, whether or not it was you who poisoned them, wouldn't it be clear if everyone searched for them?" Hila looked at him indifferently and the man's smile froze. He subconsciously took a few steps back, but very quickly, he became unyielding again. "Am I wrong? I saw you poisoning someone during the day with my own eyes. That person is still lying in the cabin, unable to get out of bed." Under the shouts of those few people, the surrounding people's gazes were attracted. After hearing that guy's vivid description, their gazes toward Hila became unfriendly. Huai Sure tried to speak, but he heard Ai Qing's voice. "I suggest we wait and see." "Just watch. Don't tell me you can make a guarantee for her?" Ai Qing asked back. "Can you be sure that she didn't do anything when you were unconscious? Also, since you were unconscious for so long, why would she suddenly splash water to wake you up?" Huai Sure was stunned and speechless. "Everyone, calm down." Beside Hila, the prostitute with a smile said, "Trust me, there's some misunderstanding here. misunderstanding my ass. As if afraid that things were not serious enough, the man with the ulcers screamed. She just wants to kill us. These two cheese might be in cahoots. The prostitute's smile froze for a moment. She looked at the man with the ulcers, and her expression revealed an almost tangible fierceness and malevolence. The chilling coldness finally made him shut his mouth. They finally understood that this was not a place to talk about reason and evidence. This was a vast ocean far away from all civilized places. On a cruise ship with nowhere to dock, the passengers did not want evidence and clues, nor did they want weak and pitiful victims. Instead, they wanted dark creatures that preyed on the weak. Poison? What a joke! Was there anyone on this ship who did not know how to use poison? Some people's farts were poisonous gas. In the short moment of silence, the crowd that was about to erupt stopped. They were stared at by that vicious gaze. The chaos that was about to erupt seemed to have died in the womb. Until someone in the crowd suddenly released a black shadow and attacked in Gila's direction. It was unclear whether it was a goo bug tamed too or something similar. The elemental parasite with thick negative energy flew in the air and pounced toward Gila. The prostitute was finally completely enraged. She roared and raised her sharp claws, wanting to break that guy's neck. But then, a cry of surprise sounded from the crowd. Unbelievable! The moment the parasite landed on Gila's body, there was a shattering sound. It was actually burned into black smoke and dissipated in an instant. In a ray of light, that ray of light was so weak that it disappeared in a flash. However, in the darkness, it was so eye-catching. It was like a crane in a flock of chickens, setting off an almost monstrous tide. Beside her, the woman with a face full of dust was the first to bear the brunt of the light. A burn mark appeared on her hand, tearing apart the layer of makeup covering her skin. It briefly revealed the loose skin covered in wrinkles and dark scars that looked like age spots. A believer? Someone said with a trembling voice. She's a believer. In the entire restaurant, everyone stood up in shock. At first, they were in disbelief. Then, their eyes became fierce and ferocious. In the crowd, a woman with unkempt hair stood up directly and pointed at Gila. She seemed to be chanting something in her mouth. But soon, the invisible curse was bounced away. A faint halo rose above Gila's head. Stigmata, the symbol of a believer. At the same time, it was also the only level 1 stigmata in the Holy Spirit lineage. Whether it was the righteous, the angels, or even Lazarus, all the stigmata in the Holy Spirit lineage extended from this foundation. It was different from the other lineages, where tens of thousands of paths led to one. It used one as the foundation and extended thousands of paths before finally returning to nothingness. The reason why the Holy Spirit lineage could reach such a large scale was related to this structure. As long as one drank the blessed holy water and was baptized, then the baptized person would become a potential member of the believer. In other words, as long as one drank the holy water and was baptized by the priest, then after the sublimation was completed, one could automatically become a believer by chanting 2 sentences from the Holy Bible. It was simple and convenient, with no side effects, fast and convenient, and it could be said that there was almost no cost at all. Even if only 1 out of 10 people chose to become a believer, then the Holy Spirit lineage would gain a loyal member. Most of the parents of the babies who were baptized at birth were devout believers. Under the influence of such a family atmosphere, very few people would make other choices. Moreover, the Holy Spirit lineage had a large business, and the treatment was never bad. The use of the stigmata of believer could be said to be widespread. In terms of cost-effectiveness, there were not many who could compare. On this foundation, the Holy Spirit lineage had grown to a terrifying scale that almost dominated the entire West in just a few hundred years. And what supported this behemoth was countless believers at the grassroots level. There were countless ascenders like hell. Even the name, stigmata, came from the scars that appeared on the body of the believers after they advanced. If it was anywhere else, Hela would definitely be respected and welcomed by the people. No matter where she went, no one would make things difficult for her. Except here. Except on this ship where the dark creatures gathered, here, except for Huaishur, everyone was a sinner who could not tolerate the dark creatures of the Holy Spirit lineage. They were chased, suppressed, and hunted by the tribunal. There were even many subspecies and origins of vampires, and it was not exclusive to the Holy Spirit lineage. Moreover, even in the Holy Spirit lineage, this was a secret among secrets, and not many people knew about it. Even if he was accidentally exposed, Huaishur could still insist that he was a Slavic lineage or a Haitian lineage troll. But believers were different. A unique lineage was simply the signature of the Holy Spirit lineage. In an instant, even Huaishur was stunned. He did not expect that there was an ally hiding on the ship. But right after that, he heard a clamorous roar and screams that sounded like a tidal wave. The entire restaurant was in an uproar. All the passengers were roaring and surrounding her with ferocious faces, revealing their cruel appearances. A dark aura spread out as if it was solid, suppressing the dim halo until it was on the verge of collapse. "Spy! Traitor! Kill her!" someone roared. "Tear her into pieces!" All the scarlet eyes stared at Hela, but the girl only pursed her lips tightly and did not say anything. The hand holding the knife trembled slightly and was swallowed by the surging crowd. A violent aura appeared on every person who boarded the ship. Everyone here had once been chased and hunted by the Holy Spirit lineage. Everyone was a failure who could not survive in the old world. The more painful it was, the more they hated those who lived under the sun. When endless hatred and anger gathered, the scene was completely out of control. As for the woman with a face full of dust, she immediately cut off her relationship with Hela and hid outside the crowd. Hela retreated step by step and was already suppressed to a corner of the restaurant, surrounded by the angry crowd. However, just as the crowd was attacking and pressing, a hand suddenly stretched out from behind and pulled away the people in front of him, almost violently kicking the people blocking the way to the side. Step by step, he walked forward. Then, he picked up a chair and smashed it on the face of the person with the ulcers, completely smashing that excited face of exultation. Finally, with a sudden punch, he smashed the table in the way. Amidst the noise, Huaishur stepped on the table he smashed and roared. "Hey! That's enough!" Chapter 133. Hey! That's enough! With the shattering of the table, the hall fell into a brief silence. The crazy crowd looked back and frowned at Huaishur, who jumped out to uphold justice. Their eyes were fierce. But then, countless pairs of bloodthirsty eyes saw the anger on the young man's face suddenly collapse and turn into a flattering smile. "This is too easy on her." At that moment, not only the stunned crowd, but even KP, who was outside the module, widened his eyes. What is he going to do? Well, he's probably seeking death. Crow pondered for a moment and couldn't help but sigh. Although I really want to praise him, I feel that this child is talented in seeking death. For some reason, her tone seemed to be quite proud. KP couldn't help but have a headache. Hey! In the dining hall, the first person to react looked coldly at Huaishur. "What the hell are you doing?" "No, I just want to ask." Huaishur jumped down from the table and smiled. He went up to the fierce man and asked, "What are you planning to do?" No, of course I don't want to ruin everyone's character. I just want to ask, how do you plan to deal with her?" The curious words made the big man frown unhappily. "Nonsense. Of course we're going to kill her." "No, I'm not asking about that." Huaishur shook his head and asked seriously, "I'm asking, how do you plan to kill her?" "Nonsense." The big man widened his eyes and raised the meat cleaver in his hand. "We'll just kill her with one cut." "Skin her!" someone shouted. "Skin her first." "My poor child." My poor child was trampled to death by their horse hoof. A woman cried and widened her scarlet eyes. I'm going to tear this little bitch apart, piece by piece, inch by inch. Blood. I want blood. No ant food. Use ant food. Hang her. Someone roared. Of course, hang her. In an instant the crowd became noisy. These dark creatures from all over the world had no lack of various ways to kill. For a moment, in order to persuade others to follow their suggestions, they began to quarrel and push. TSK, 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 TSK. Why sure couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. He knocked on the table again, attracting everyone's attention. Then, he asked impatiently, All right, is that all? As he spoke, his eyes involuntarily became filled with disdain. Only this much? Don't you have anything new? That faint disdain actually made those crazy people speechless. But before they could react, Huaishe jumped onto the table, clasped his hands behind his back, and looked around at the crowd under his feet as if he was looking at a group of idiots. He raised his voice and asked, What the hell are you doing? Have you figured out what she is? Just as someone was about to speak, Huaishe suddenly pointed at Hela, who was standing behind the crowd, and said in a trembling voice, This is a spy. A traitor. A traitor who sneaked into our pure team and tried to corrupt our morals. As he spoke, he raised his voice and announced loudly, Everyone, this is a conspiracy. A plot by a Holy Spirit lineage against the persecuted. And now, this conspiracy has been seen through by us. Facts have proven that no one can play tricks in our pure organization. No one. And we, in this struggle, have obtained victory. Following Huaishe's impassioned words and waving his arms, those in the crowd shouted excitedly. But then, Huaishe poured a bucket of cold water over them. And then? What are you doing here? Eating? Chopping to death? Hanging? Tearing? Do you even have any thoughts in your heads? Or are you saying that you're cannibals from Africa? Brother Black, sit back down. I didn't say that you, king retards, is that all you have in your heads? Or are you really monsters in the Holy Spirit lineage, beasts that only know how to eat people? Then what do you think we should do? In the surging crowd, someone shouted unhappily, Do you have a better idea? Of course. Huaishe replied proudly with his hands behind his back. Facing everyone's curious and suspicious eyes, Huaishe raised a finger and made a classic gesture from a certain emoji pack. He announced solemnly, Of course, trial? That's right. A trial. He raised his voice and said solemnly, A trial from the dark world. A great sacrifice to prove our determination to the great White Crown King. On the table, Huaishe clenched his fists and stared at the stunned compatriots below the stage. He said vehemently, Different from the sad times of the past when we fled in a sorry state, we have bid farewell to that time of destitution. Friends, from today onwards, it's time for us to launch a counterattack against the persecution of the past. This is a trial from us, the victims. A counterattack and revenge against the Holy Spirit lineage. Huaishe roared, waving his fists and shouting loudly. Right now, right here, on this ship. There was a moment of dead silence. Ai Qing helplessly covered her face and sighed. She waved her hand and passed the skill judgment. The faint sound of dice sounded and the dust settled. Speech judgment was 15 points passed. And bluff was 1 point? Great success. KP laid on the table and stared at the result. He widened his eyes in disbelief. What kind of King joke is this? I told you. Crow whistled and smiled happily, he's talented. In the dining hall there was dead silence. In the silence where a pin drop could be heard, everyone looked at each other in shock, as if they hadn't reacted yet. But very quickly, fanatical and excited expressions appeared in those bloodthirsty eyes. Although I don't know what he said, I feel that what he said makes sense. A kobold said excitedly to the person next to him, Why don't we try it? Damn trial? How fresh. Although the people here more or less had relatives or friends who had participated in the trial, they were all standing in the dock and being pinned to the ground by the Holy Spirit. They were condemned by the public, then dragged out and burned to death on the stake. How could there be such a fantasy event where the Holy Spirit lineage was judged? They didn't even dare to think about it in their dreams. It sounded so cool to let the judges, who used to be awe-inspiring, sit in the dock and accept the judgment from the dark world. Trial! 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 Someone shouted excitedly and clapped his hands fanatically. We want to see the trial! 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 In an instant, the roars of countless people rang out amidst the thunderous applause. Huaishur, on the other hand, quietly wiped away the cold sweat on her forehead. She smiled and nodded to the audience below the stage. Finally, she let out a sigh of relief. Men, tie her up and throw her into the kitchen. He pointed at Hela and ordered loudly, wait for the judgment from justice. The crowd roared in response. From the beginning to the end, at the entrance of the restaurant, the young man holding the cat looked at all of this mockingly. It was as if he was watching a farce of ants. There was a saying that when people gathered firewood, the flames would grow. When the enthusiasm of this group of dark creatures was aroused, they moved at an unimaginable speed. Soon, the tables and chairs were cleared and arranged around the podium at the end of the restaurant to look like a judge's seat. Then, after a unanimous vote, Huaishur, a fellow compatriot with ideas, was appointed as the prosecutor. The kobold who had cheered first changed into a white wig and fought with a few people for the judge's seat. They even pretended to find a lawyer for Hela. Although the lawyer was a fat man who stuttered and couldn't even speak properly, at least there was something like that. Huaishur sat next to the judge's seat and discussed the trial process with the green goblin who had been hung up. Soon, the general steps were finalized. In the end, he even asked, "Have you prepared the firewood? Don't be afraid that after the trial is over, there won't be any firewood for the execution." "Yes, yes, I've moved the fuel tanks from the back over here." The green goblin nodded excitedly and pointed at the gas tanks below the judge's seat. Seeing this, Huaishur's heart skipped a beat. "Oh my God, you're going to blow the judge and the jury up into the sky together. Even the slightest spark will cause a boom. Forget it, it has nothing to do with me anyway." Huaishur nodded to indicate that he had done a good job. Then, he threw the mess to these people and excused himself to go back to his room to change his clothes. In the corridor, Ai Ching finally sighed helplessly. "What do you want to do?" "To be honest, I don't know." Huaishur shook his head. "Actually, your suggestion has always been right. It's fine to wait and see, but I don't want to be left alone." Ai Ching's voice became serious. "You're taking a risk, and it's meaningless." "She saved me, didn't she?" Huaishur asked softly. "If it weren't for her, I might have been thrown into the sea." Ai Ching was silent. "To be honest, I still don't know what I should do, and I can't find anything to do. But I feel that I can't go on like this." Huaishur scratched his head, a little depressed. "At least, before the situation gets worse, I have to do something that I want to do." "So you saved her?" "No, I just want to believe in her." Huaishur retorted, "Is it something inconceivable to trust someone who saved you?" Ai Ching didn't say anything more. She just reminded him, "You don't have much time. 5 minutes, I can do it. Trust me. I have a lot of experience in breaking the law." Huaishur closed the door of his room, rubbed his hands, and took off the coat that was in the way. Then, he took out a knife and quickly unscrewed the screws on the window of his room one by one. Then, he reached out and pulled. The entire heavy-tempered glass window was pulled down from the deck. Huaishur lowered her head and stared at the dark sea outside the window. She put on her mask, took a deep breath, and encouraged herself. "I can do it, I can do it." In an instant, he jumped down. Chapter 134. In an instant the wind howled. The dark surface of the sea rushed toward him. In the endless darkness, Huai spread out his arms and felt the wind in his face. The dark surface of the sea was as calm as marble, almost reflecting his gradually turning scarlet eyes. He was like a black bird, briefly galloping between the black sky and the black sea. It was difficult to tell them apart in the darkness. It was like a black youth in Equatorial Guinea studying the cultivation techniques of black fungus late at night. Inexplicably, Huai suddenly thought so. Then he began to fall down toward the surface of the sea. So he began to contract his limbs to welcome the coming impact. And at the moment when the fall was about to end, roaring thunder burst out from the dead silence. Relying on the gravitational acceleration and inertia impact brought about by the short fall, Huai collided with the mutated surface of the sea, like a rubber ball hitting a glass plate. In an instant, the vampire stigmata was activated. His weight was reduced by a third in an instant, and the burst of power was above his usual output. He stepped on the broken surface of the sea and flew forward, running wildly. It was said that if an adult wanted to run on the water, he must reach a speed of more than 110 kilometers per hour and have a muscle strength more than 15 times that of an ordinary person. Only then could he rely on the force of the surface of the water to support his body. Now Huai was measuring his own speed, and he did not know how much Van Helsing's strength exceeded that of an ordinary person. But the vampire's extraordinary physique and speed allowed him to achieve this incredible miracle. It was like a stone skipping across water. The vampire, who abandoned his weight, opened his arms and stepped on the surface of the sea briskly and quickly, leaving a trail of broken marks. He stepped on the bursting ripples and galloped forward. It was like dancing on the top of the wave. At this moment, in addition to the indescribable excitement, there was also a trace of rejoicing in his heart. One must know that in the legends, apart from a few stagnant quagmires, vampires were unable to cross any living water, let alone the sea. If he was an authentic vampire of the Wallachian lineage, he would have already sunk into the water and been completely digested by the gastric juices of the seawater. But now, he was sprinting forward, catching up to the speed of the steel cruise ship in an instant. He even swept past most of the ship's hull, rushing from the rear passenger area to the front near the public area. Thanks to the noise of the passengers and the excellent soundproofing of the cruise ship, Huai loud footsteps on the water did not attract any attention. Under the cover of darkness, there was probably no one who could see the rushing vampire. As he leaped, his arm grabbed onto the protruding porthole on the outside of the cruise ship. In just 12 seconds, he felt as if he had run a marathon. He couldn't help but pant violently. When he saw the traces of seawater corrosion on his shoes, he couldn't help but feel scared. Just now, it was like walking on a tightrope above the abyss. If he took one wrong step, he would have no room for regret. Fortunately, the most difficult part was over. The next step was how to find Gila, who was thrown into the kitchen. Perhaps the sound of Huai collision attracted someone's attention. In the corner of the staff corridor outside the kitchen, the kobold who had taken advantage of the fact that there was no one around to pee raised his head and looked in the direction of the porthole. It was still dark outside the window. It was empty. He glanced at it curiously before withdrawing his gaze. He took out a piece of paper from his pocket and continued to practice his impassioned tone, rehearsing his lines. "I declare that in the name of the dark races, you are sentenced to death." After saying that, he felt that the last word should have been more serious. He coughed twice and started practicing again. But there was a constant tapping sound outside the window, like a bird pecking at the glass, making him unable to calm down. He scratched the sparse hair on the dog's head in annoyance and walked forward, wanting to chase away the annoying bird. But when he got close to the window, he saw nothing. In the darkness, 2 scarlet lights suddenly lit up. "That's a face?" The next moment, the glass shattered, and a hand suddenly reached in from outside the window. The 5 fingers grabbed his throat like an iron clamp, and then suddenly pulled. In an instant, he was involuntarily pulled out of the window. Not bad, but unfortunately, you don't have the talent for acting. Huaisher finally praised, goodbye. Then, he let go of his hand. Amid the panicked screams, the kobold fell into the sea and was instantly swallowed by the darkness. And Huaisher, as if he had no bones, nimbly squeezed through the narrow porthole and landed in the corridor. It was silent, as if no one had noticed. Very good. Next, it was time for the sneaking game's best friend, the ventilation duct. With the vampire's outstanding skills that even Huaisher was afraid of, he did not spend much effort to sneak to the upper side of the kitchen. Unexpectedly, Hila was not locked in a cage. She was just tied up and watched by 2 people. She slumped on the chair, weakly hanging her head, waiting for the next trial. The 2 men were casually smoking and talking in a thick Roman dialect. From time to time, they would look at Hila's body with a perverted gaze that could be used anywhere in the world. There were only 2 people. Very good, it saved me a lot of trouble. Huaisher crouched in the ventilation duct and looked down at the 2 people's faces through the ventilation grate. She didn't know if it was because she had good eyesight or if it was because her detection was successful, but she could see the 2 people's figures clearly. One of them was tall and thin, with a face full of wood-like wrinkles. His features were conspicuous, and it should be a sacred mark of a tree spirit. The other short man had an obvious horny layer behind his ears. Traces of scales could be seen on his hands and neck, and there was a faint bulge on his forehead, like a horn. Although it was not clear whether it was a lizard or a cow, it could be concluded that it was a sacred mark of a beast, which was generally the type with high defense and high HP. It could only be killed quickly with poison. Soon, Huaisher felt that something was wrong, because the saliva that the man spat on the ground seemed to have a strong poison, corroding the steel plate with a sizzling sound. Poisonous saliva, a head that was twice as big as the average person, and a pair of sunglasses on his face. Huaisher wiped the cold sweat off his forehead. He almost made a mistake. Although there were a lot of lizard features and cow horns, and he looked like a boorish man with high defense and HP, this guy was most likely a sacred mark of a snake monster. If he guessed correctly, it should be a 3rd-order sacred mark from Greece, Catoblepas, one of the legendary descendants of Medusa, who inherited Medusa's ability to kill with his gaze. Although the rumors were exaggerated, being stared at by him would probably immediately cause one to be poisoned, right? After all, this kind of ability that used the gaze as a medium was generally quite tricky and had to be dealt with properly. There were only 2 of them, which was considered lucky. After the observation, Huaisher took a deep breath, slowly took out his weapon, and carefully smeared the sword oil and poison with a cotton swab. Next, it was time to check to what extent Van Helsing's strength and skills as a dark assassin could reach. He took a deep breath. He couldn't feel his heart beating in his chest. His body temperature dropped rapidly until it finally turned into cold iron stone. Behind the mask, his face was so pale that there was no color, and only his pair of red eyes became colder and colder. He blended into the darkness. In the silence, only the slender test tube rotated rapidly between Huaisher's fingers. In the rapid and silent shaking, the color of the ink suspended in the middle of the viscous liquid gradually spread out, turning the liquid in the test tube into viscous ink. At that moment, Huaisher closed his eyes. In the kitchen, everyone heard a sharp sound. It was the sound of the ventilation duct's exit being smashed by the blade. Then, from the crack above their heads, a figure shot out like lightning. The moment the 2 of them turned around, they saw the figure in the air throwing a test tube at them. The test tube flew over and shattered into pieces at their feet. The viscous ink that flowed within the test tube splashed out. When it came into contact with the air, it began to expand rapidly, turning into a thick smoke that spread out like a geyser, swallowing everything. Darkness struck. Huaishur had already fallen from the air. Relying on the force of his fall, the dagger in his hand pierced through the head of the tall and skinny tree spirit like a hot knife through butter. It cut through the skull, went straight to the brain, and finally pierced through the chin with the tip of the dagger. In the coughing black fog, the snake monster with the sunglasses subconsciously wanted to open his mouth and scream, but then he felt the sound of wind. A palm rose from below and suddenly pushed against his open chin, bursting with power. His open mouth suddenly closed, swallowing the panicked cry into his stomach, and then he spat out half of his bitten tongue. Without waiting for the blood and tongue to fall to the ground, Huaishur's left hand had already pulled out a throwing knife from the back of his waist and directly nailed it into the snake monster's right shoulder. Relying on his understanding of the human body's structure and this skillful and frightening memory of killing, he wedged the fragile throwing knife directly into the gap between the shoulder blade. And his right hand that had been pushing the snake monster's chin had already pulled out a dagger from the back of his neck. The sharp blade drew an arc across the top of Huaishur's head and in front of the snake monster's eye socket. The two shattering sounds overlapped into a fine and crisp sound. After the broken sunglasses, the broken eyeballs did not have time to release the fatal poisonous vision before blood flowed out, and he could no longer see anything. In its panic, the snake monster tried to retreat. It waved its remaining left hand with all its might, trying to expel the invisible ghost. But then, it felt a chill in its chest. As the dagger completed its mission, Huaishur had already thrown it into the air. Then, he pulled out the dagger from his waist and stabbed forward. With a muffled sound, the dagger pierced through the snake monster's heart, and blood gushed out. Huaishur let go of his hand and caught the falling dagger with his limbs. Then he turned his hand and nailed the dagger into the snake monster's throat, completely cutting off the snake monster's last possibility to make a sound. He turned around and looked at the other tree spirit. This kind of plant type of stigmata usually had a terrifying vitality. Even if his brain was penetrated, he still had some consciousness left. He struggled in a daze and did not understand what had happened. He just struggled in a daze, groping his head and dully pinching the handle on his head. He did not know what had happened. Soon, he didn't need to think anymore. Huaishur took the axe from his back, raised his hand and swung it hard. Bang! The dark smoke spread in an instant, but then dissipated in an instant. When the curtain was covered, what was revealed was not an exquisite setting, but a tragic blood red. Chapter 135. In the silence, there was only a soft sound like a ball rolling. A head with a dagger nailed to it fell from the sky and rolled in a pool of blood. Finally, it stopped and stared blankly at the crack in the ceiling. Under the countless traces of blood, the walls, floor, and everything had been changed beyond recognition. Two broken bodies fell to the ground with a muffled sound, revealing the dark figure in the middle of them. Huaishur shook off the blood on the axe and put away the weapon on the ground. Then, he quickly walked to Hela and cut the rope on her hand. Hela looked at him in shock and disbelief. "You're here to save me?" "No, you have to run by yourself." Huaishur shoved a rope into Hela's hand and pulled her to the opening in the ventilation duct. She pointed at the opening above. "Go left and go down to the corridor. Take the rope and crawl out through the window. Then go to the deck. If there are people, hide there for a while. I'll make a big commotion to attract their attention. After you escape into the passenger area, go to room 1011. Here's the key, you can hide there." That was Yu Jun's room. Now that Yu Jun was dead, no one would go there. It was the perfect place for her to hide. Hela looked at him blankly, as if she still did not understand what had happened. Huaishur shook his head and sighed. He grabbed her hand and was about to send her up, but then, he could not help but be stunned. He felt as if he had grabbed a pile of mud. Her hand melted in his palm. Then, he felt a chill on his back. He looked down and saw a knife sticking out of his chest. Unfortunately, you saved the wrong person. Behind him, Gila laughed mockingly. Her face flowed down like mud and fell to the ground, turning into stinky river mud. Behind the river mud, an ugly face covered with old wrinkles and spots appeared. He had never seen it before. However, with the disturbance of the mud, the stench disappeared, and the face slowly healed as if it had recovered its youth. Then, it became lively and beautiful, without any signs of aging. Spring demon. Huai Shi suddenly understood. The witch hiding in the stagnant water in Norse legends, the wanton and cruel demon you are. Huai Shi looked at the woman in shock. Who are you? Thus, the smug face became distorted. She suddenly pulled back her hand, pulled out the dagger, and allowed Huai Shi to fall to the ground. Then, she raised her foot and angrily stepped on Huai Shi's face. Eleanor! Lady Eleanor! You'd better remember this, you bastard! She suppressed her anger, and her beautiful fake face twisted in anger. Damn it, I should have been a noble countess. I should have. Damn it. How did I end up in the same boat as you bumpkins? Huai Shi coughed violently. She stepped on his face and he vomited blood. I knew something was wrong. I knew you were up to no good, you little bastard. I knew it. The woman who called herself Madame Eleanor gritted her teeth and spat a mouthful of stinking phlegm on the ground. I caught you. You really did hook up with that little bitch, didn't you? She reached out and pulled open the door of the cold storage. She pulled the shivering girl out and violently threw her on the ground. Then, she pulled her hair and pulled her up. She held her face and made her look at Huai Shi on the ground. Look who's here? My little baby. She laughed sharply. I guessed right, didn't I? There are always fools attracted by your young and beautiful face. They're like mosquitoes, buzzing around the flame. How smug, how stylish. Ah, this feels pretty good, doesn't it? Gila's lips were bruised from the cold, and she could no longer speak. She could only look at Huai Shi in shock. On the ground, Huai Shi awkwardly squeezed out a smile at her. Ah, we meet again. Asterisk slap. Asterisk the sprite impatiently bent down and slapped Huai Shi. She pulled Gila's hair and looked at her delicate face with jealousy. My patience is over, little bitch. Since you're not willing to speak with a kind attitude, let's be violent. It's useless. You're too old. Gila looked at the sprite with pity. Even if you have my blood, you won't be able to regain your youth. Shut up. The sprite screamed. Her expression became ferocious and twisted. The layer of mud on her face cracked. Give it to me. Give me your blood. Don't play tricks. Give me your blood willingly, baby, and I'll fulfill your wish, just like in fairy tales. This was a vicious fairy tale that had once been circulated all over the world. It was about the transactions between witches and ignorant girls, such as the daughter of the sea, and all the other girls who overestimated themselves and did not know what they were getting, thinking that they could fulfill their wishes if they got something. The result was no doubt. All the ignorant traitors were skinned alive and devoured by the witches, leaving only regret. Ever since King Arthur died tragically in the sword fence, no one would believe that the woman who came out of the spring had kindness. After all, no one would believe that a wet woman gave you a rusty sword and you could become a king, right? What can you give me? Gila asked. Freedom? Oh, my dear, I can let you go if you can. The sprite grinned and pointed the knife at Huai Shi's face. Or I can spare his life. How about it? In the silence, Gila was silent. She just looked at Huai Shi's face. After a long time, she looked down. You swear, she said. Of course I swear. The sprite laughed excitedly. I swear to all living water that I won't kill him. Now give me blood. Immediately. All of it. As soon as she finished speaking, she felt someone pulling her. Huai Shi was lying on the ground. In the pool of blood, Huai Shi struggled to reach out and pull her skirt. His lips opened and closed, and he spat out blood foam in a violent cough, trying to make a sound. What's going on? The last confession? So cute. Spring Demon laughed sharply. He bent down and looked at Ming Chi's embarrassed appearance. Then, he vaguely heard Huaishi's voice. Elephant, elephant? What elephant? She frowned in confusion and listened carefully. Then she heard the man on the ground whispering in a hoarse voice. She didn't know if it was sleep talking or singing, but the tune was strange. Elephant. Elephant. He was singing softly, singing a children's song that she didn't know how to put together. In the end, his voice was getting weaker and weaker. Your neck. Why is it so long? At that moment, the sprite looked down in shock and saw Huaishi's scarlet eyes in the pool of blood. 4 canine teeth were slowly growing out of his mouth. Then, the tune became cruel and violent. It was like an angry elephant finally couldn't stand the dead child's nagging. It impatiently raised its foot and kicked the child to death on the spot, and then spat on the corpse. Damn it, Gonli, I'm a giraffe. She felt a chill. At that moment, Huaishi on the ground suddenly bounced up. He opened his mouth and bit the sprite's neck, penetrating the artery, and crazily sucking the substance that represented life. You want blood, don't you? What a coincidence, I want it too. That feeling was indescribably intoxicating. It was like drinking sweet dew. It was obviously stinky blood, but the moment it entered the mouth, it made people feel happy as if they had ascended to heaven. But the sprite screamed in pain. The scream was drowned in her throat, and her life was quickly fading away. Under the nourishment of the blood, the vampire's stigmata became more active than ever. It quickly repaired Huaishi's body, and even made him stronger and more agile. It was like a ghost that was stuffed with the dust of the liberated. When drinking the blood, the vampire's stigmata could be truly complete and truly awaken. He had truly obtained that forbidden power. Above the 4 canine teeth, runes inlaid with pure silver slowly emerged, purifying all dark species equally. Not only the sprite but also Huaishi. This was the strongest weapon of the demon hunter, Van Helsing. Relying on the vampire's characteristic of devouring life, he gave the enemy an irresistible purification, and then used the blood he drank to repair his body and maintain his integrity. In just a moment, cracks appeared on half of the sprite's body. She could no longer wear the disguise of youth, revealing her old and shriveled appearance. She screamed in pain and struggled hard. Ignoring her neck being torn, she forcibly pushed Huaishi away. But there was a huge crack on her neck, and blood kept gushing out. You, she stared at Huaishi crazily, opened her mouth and roared silently, calling for her husband. Then, the door was suddenly pushed open, and the dull man guarding outside rushed in. With every step forward, his body expanded. After 3 steps, he completely turned into the legendary bloodthirsty and tyrannical Cyclops. Then, he found a huge hole in his chest, and the heart that had been plucked out. Bang! The giant fell to the ground. The person holding the heart slowly closed the door, not letting the noisy crowd outside know what was happening in the kitchen. Huaishi raised his hand and crooked his finger at the sprite. The crossbow arrow tied to his arm burst out with a sharp whistle, and completely penetrated the sprite's head. It completely blew up the pile of mud. To be honest, Huaishi couldn't remember her name in the end. But when he turned around and prepared to fight the giant, he saw the corpse on the ground and Yin Yen leaning against the door. Weighing the rotten heart in his hand, Yin Yen sneered and threw the thing aside. He looked at the stunned Huaishi. The moment the man rushed in, Yin Yen, who had been hiding for a long time, suddenly attacked from behind. With his sharp claws, he dug out the heart of the zombie giant. But why him? Are you out of your mind? Huaishi asked in shock. Yin Yen glanced at him coldly. Why don't you ask your magical little conch? What's going on? Huaishi asked Ai Qing, who was hiding in his mind. The magical little conch, Ai Qing, suddenly didn't want to talk to him. Chapter 136. Do you still need to ask? Ai Ching sneered. My cousin is afraid, isn't he? He's in a hurry to find someone to form an alliance with. Huai Shi looked at Yin Yen and asked seriously, Why me? At least you're more conscientious than my cousin, and you're less like a traitor than the others. Is this reason enough? Yin Yen asked. From the beginning, he knew that Huai Shi was definitely going to do something. Relying on his divine mark, he hid here and witnessed the whole process. He knew that Huai Shi's actions didn't seem to be fake, and then he appeared. One of you is a vampire, and the other is a believer. Hey, what the Holy Spirit lineage wants to do on the ship has nothing to do with me, and my secret has nothing to do with you. Yin Yen asked, I'll help you, and you help me. How about that? Alliance? Huai Shi asked cautiously. To be honest, compared to others, I don't trust your family's magical conch more. Yin Yen said indifferently. We can't form an alliance, but if we do, it's one more insurance. Don't let go. Ai Ching seemed to see what he was hiding behind his indifferent face. He's here to ask for help. Force him to take out something. Seeing Huai Shi's serious face, Yin Yen asked, If I'm not wrong, she should be asking you to put on a negotiating face to deal with me, right? Huai Shi was silent. He felt that he had become a platform for the siblings to fight. It doesn't matter. I have a free information for you, Yin Yen said calmly. Last night, I hid at the entrance of the warehouse and saw with my own eyes that Lei Feizhou and others worked together to chop off Yu Jun's head. How about it? Is this information important enough? As he spoke, he enjoyed the stunned expression on Huai Shi's face and showed a mocking smile. You're not the only one who's become capable these years, sister. This title always sounded meaningful, and it was hard to tell whether it was affectionate or resentful. What do you want? Ai Ching asked directly. How about you help me kill that old man, Kush? Yin Yen suddenly said. No. Huai Shi conveyed Ai Ching's answer. The price you want is too high. Until now, he still hadn't reacted, and he couldn't figure out whether this was Yin Yan's trick or his true purpose. He was even a little skeptical about the news he had told him. You just have to help when necessary. How about it? Yin Yen said. Before that, just don't get in the way. Do you agree? Huai Shi asked. Of course, why not? Ai Ching said calmly. At worst, we'll just go back on our word. You guys are all dirty when it comes to tactics. Huai Shi nodded helplessly. Very good. Yin Yen looked at him deeply. I will come to you when necessary. He took a step back and his figure disappeared. He only saw the door open and close. After the previous incident, he seemed to have learned his lesson and didn't leave any traces for Huai Shi to track. Huai Shi didn't even know if he was still in this room. However, there wasn't much time left. He sighed and reached out his hand. Let's go. We need to leave this place quickly. Hila stared at him for a long time. It was only when Huai Shi couldn't wait any longer that she grabbed Huai Shi's hand. Let's go, she said. Huai Shi waved his arm and threw her into the ventilation duct. After a short crawling forward, Huai Shi suddenly heard a faint voice in front of him. Thank you. Ah, you're welcome. He subconsciously looked up and saw the sole of a shoe rapidly enlarging in front of his eyes and kicking his face. Don't look. Okay. Only then did Huai Shi remember that she was wearing a dress. He quickly lowered his head and pretended not to see anything as he crawled forward. Soon, the ventilation duct came to an end. Hila jumped down. In the silence, Huai Shi sighed, wiped the shoe print on his face, and jumped down. Then, he froze on the spot. He saw the youth leaning against the wall in front of the broken porthole and the blood spreading to his feet. An orange cat sat quietly in the pool of blood, bent down, and slowly licked the corpse that still had the aura of life just a moment ago. He took his time eating his meal. Hila. It was as if she had been torn apart. Before she landed, she had already been shattered into several pieces. Her pale face stared blankly at the crack in the ceiling. Until the last moment, until death, there was still a smile on her lips that Huai Shi had never seen before. It was gentle like the morning dew, so light that it was about to evaporate under the sun. Huai Shi looked away and didn't dare to look again. He raised his head and looked at the pharaoh from Egypt. The pharaoh was also looking at him with a smile that was not only caring but also mocking. I see that you seem to have been held hostage by that woman. It's okay to come over and help, right? In the long silence, Huai Shi clenched and unclenched his fists. After a long time, he raised his head and smiled gratefully. No. He lowered his head deeply. Thank you for your help, Your Excellency. That's good. Ha 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 ha. The pharaoh enjoyed his grateful look and laughed happily. He waved at the cat on the ground. Let's go, Sphinx. The cat reluctantly licked the blood that was still warm, then turned around and left with its owner. Only Huai Shi still stood where he was, maintaining his bowing posture of gratitude. After a long, long time, he said softly, Ai Qing, I must kill him. When Huai Shi returned to the scene, the trial had already ended. Not long after, someone discovered that the prisoner tried to escape and was killed by the pharaoh himself. Although no one could sentence Hela to death in the name of the Dark World, no one was bold enough to run to the pharaoh and say that it was too disappointing. Everyone hadn't had a good time yet. The dark creatures were definitely experts at bullying the weak and fearing the strong. Moreover, after being surrounded and suppressed by the Holy Spirit lineage for so many years, those with noble morals had probably all died long ago. The Pope that often appeared in novels was a bad ghost, and the dark creatures were all heroes. Most of the time, things that happened would not appear. They were just a group of frightened birds, and they were even scared out of their wits. When they saw a believer appear on the ship, they screamed and wanted to call for their mother. Would the new world really give them a place to stay? Huai Shi took a deep look at the empty courtroom and turned to leave. She turned around and returned to her room. When he pushed open the door, he couldn't help but hold his breath. Sorry, that room is a little dirty, so I came to your place. On the chair in front of the window, the girl who was reading looked up. Her silver hair shone with a metallic glow under the oil lamp. It was Hela. Huai Shi looked at her in a daze. His lips opened, but he didn't know what to say. You're not, it's just a double body trick. Hela tilted her head and looked at him. Haven't you seen it before? Double body doppelganger. It meant that two people with similar appearances could be directly understood as double bodies or double existences. Simply put, it was the phenomenon of two people who were exactly the same. From memory to appearance, there was no difference at all. It was difficult to tell them apart. From Egypt to Rome, similar rumors could be found everywhere, and the terrifying legends that were derived from it were countless. For those who ascended, this was a rare technique. Usually, only scholars would try to study this trick of placing the soul mirror image in a puppet. After all, very few people could multitask and control two bodies at the same time. Moreover, materials that matched their soul attributes were often too rare, and it was troublesome to create. Due to the innate limitations of the materials, it could not even provide stronger combat power. It was just a puppet that could conveniently do two things at the same time. There were even more convenient alternatives. Therefore, except for a few fields, very few people would study these things. Huai Shi stared at Hela in front of him in shock. He could not help but step forward and carefully touch her shoulder. You're really not dead? As if not used to this kind of intimate contact, Hela could not help but frown. If you don't mind, I can step on you again. I promise it's the same size as the shoe print on your face. No need, no need. Huai Shi could not help but reach out to wipe his face, but after wiping for a long time, he could not see any dirt or ashes. Only then did he see Hela's smile that was as light as dew. He coughed a few times, sat by the bed and carefully asked, "Then, are we considered friends?" "Not really." Hila shook her head and said calmly, after leaving this ship, we'll be strangers. There's no need to establish such a close relationship. She said, as long as we're not friends, anything is fine. Huaishur was confused. If you become my friend, I'll have to start being wary of you. She stared into Huaishur's eyes and told him as if she was telling him the truth. Otherwise, you'll betray me when I trust you the most. Huaishur did not know who taught her such hardcore logic, so he could only nod helplessly. Okay, ally, okay? No matter what, being an ally was a good thing. At least it seemed more reliable than his teammates who were all like traitors. Then, what's your name? Hila asked seriously. As allies, we should first tell each other our names, right? Huaishur. Huaishur hesitated for a moment before saying his real name. As you can see, I'm a vegetarian vampire. Hila did not say anything, only looking straight at him as if she was trying to tell if he was lying. After a long time, she nodded in satisfaction. Lily, she said. You can call me Lily. Lily. Not Hila? Huaishur was stunned. HL is my registered name. Hila raised the heavy ancient book in her hand. It's a rule among scholars. When I'm doing something as a scholar, I have to tell others this name. But as a partner, you can call me Lily. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.